just.
So we'll go ahead and get started. I know Steve's going to be a little late, and Sean is joining us on video. Can you hear us, Sean?
Probably not if Mike has experience.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, sounds good. All right, well, let's get to work and crunch some numbers. Is that what they say in the accounting?
Yes.
So,
Absolutely.
Carter, I'm going to turn it over to you to get us started,
Okay, very good.
and we'll go from there.
Awesome.
Got your calculator.
Slide rule.
Slide rule.
It's at home on the shelf.
Well, Mr. Mayor, good evening, everybody. It's good to be with all of you. Thank you for being here. One of the things, though, that I was hoping we could take care of that isn't on the agenda, so to speak, is finalizing the roles that our attendees that go to Wham will have. If that's okay with you, sir. And frankly, I can't remember exactly how it works out. I think you're going to be the Resolutions Committee designee with Councilman Cathy as an alternate.
Yes.
To that to be the case. And the voting delegate was who? Oh, the mayor as well. Okay, all right. And you, of course, have Councilman Gamroff as a board member there too.
Yep, and I believe, are you going to, Lisa? Okay, yep.
Great. So
I don't have to be there for the resolutions committee then?
unless you want to participate in the dialogue and the debate,
Okay.
that would be my
what has been communicated to me at that resolution committee, that there's going to be conversations and debate about that, and you're welcome to be a part of that, as obviously you can be there if you'd like to. Otherwise, the voting will primarily I'll end up doing the voting at the end. So, yeah.
Very good. So if council's good with that, Mr. Mayor, then I think that's all. Thumbs up will be all I need, and we'll take that with us to Wham next week.
Sounds good.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Perfect.
Now, do you have me spending a night or anything?
Mr. Mayor, I don't think we do. Did
Okay.
you want to, or
No, I was planning on going down and coming back.
that day?
Yes.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to double check and make sure, because we don't need.
When is that?
That is Wednesday through Friday of next week. Yeah, Wednesday about lunch is when we start, kind of a thing. Okay. Very good. Thank you, sir.
Yep.
All right. Well, I will go ahead and proceed then, if that's okay, Mr. Mayor.
Yes.
I appreciate the opportunity to get to visit with you about the budget. You've had the opportunity to look over the budget document and now the budget narrative, and you probably already know this too, but you've also participated to a fairly extensive degree with regard to a lot of the major budgetary topics that your proposed budget covers for you. We dealt with utilities over the past few months. We dealt with capital, at least in a starting degree anyway. We've dealt with, again, sort of in a provisionary direction, employee costs. There's a number of things that you've already provided a lot of feedback for, and I appreciate that, because that helped us to kind of have the answers to the quiz and put a lot of the major components of the budget together in a very helpful way. So thank you for the work that you've put forward already. And your attention tonight, of course, will be very appreciated, along with any questions or directives or guidance you may want to give. We certainly, of course, are open to homework. And if we need to bring homework back in another meeting, we as your staff team are committed to doing that too. So we have a lot of ways we can go tonight, a lot of directions we can go. And if we can't answer your questions tonight, I'm sure that by looking into some of those matters, we'll be able to bring answers back to you fairly directly. I want to thank the staff team too for all the work that they've put in getting us to this point. For a $165 million budget that includes a $40 million capital agenda, that really is no small feat. And without a doubt, without the help of our department head team and their teams and extensive work on the part of the finance team and you know, folks in my office, this would really be much more Herculean to get done. So my gratitude to all of our staff folks and the work that they've put forward as well. As I mentioned, you're looking at a $165 million budget, which, as you can tell here, well, before I move in, let me just give you a couple precepts and principles that are important for you to understand about the budget that you're reviewing. Without a doubt, in my estimation, the budget that you have on hand is indeed a conservative approach to budgeting in general. We are not betting on the future of revenues that we don't have good data that are going to be there. We aren't trying to suck up reserves, as it were. Those, for the most part, are being left alone, and particularly for the policy-driven reserves, you will not see recommendations that siphon those off. We've really tried to build a prospectus here that does not envision things that we haven't already talked about or aren't real clear with regard to the data that's available in putting this together. We do have positions that we're asking you for, and I think you'll find as we get to that point, it's not a lot. It's not many positions, particularly as the general fund is concerned. This would speak to also being more conservative in our approach. We don't, inflate revenue projections in order to make the budget balance. If we had balancing issues, we dealt with it from an expense standpoint without getting out of control from a revenue standpoint, and hopefully you'll see that as we go through this. We did incorporate these series of suggestions from our previous work session on this topic. Without a doubt, we're going to be talking about that again tonight, and if indeed we need to adjust those to help you feel more comfortable moving forward, we can do that, and we'll go into that in a lot more detail. As I mentioned, also, we do have a fairly ambitious capital program over the next year that we're proposing. It's a $40 million program. But I'll remind you, and this will be an important point for the next slide I share with you, we are not proposing capital to be done outside of cash that we already have available, that we already have on hand, unless it's a grant program that we are talking about pursuing. And just like with any grant project that I've ever been involved with, if grant money doesn't come forward, we don't do the project. So be aware that that is my position with you still. If the grant money doesn't come forward, we don't work on the project, and we try it again, or we put it off, or come to you with different ideas in general. And again, that's important with respect to what you're about to see here. And so this button, it doesn't drag like that, and my buttons are not working. I might have turned it off accidentally. Let me give me just a second here. Is it frozen?
Amendment?
Oh, there we go.
No, it isn't, because I went through it.
Thank you. Oh, you did that. Oh, okay. All right. Do I need this then? Okay, now it works. Okay, all right, good. One of the questions that Councilman Nell proposed right from the beginning when we handed out the very first preliminary resolution was with regard to the imbalance that his constituents had identified to him and so forth, moving from FY22 to FY23. And I wanted to tackle that. I appreciate that question, by the way, because it gave us some opportunities to work with some questions of concern that citizens might have. A historical perspective with regard to budgets that we've passed over the years and some of the challenges that we face when we compare budgets from a moment in time to other moments in time. Sometimes it can be a little tricky, particularly when you consider some of the dynamics we deal with as it relates to budgeting. Many of you remember and of course deal with our amendment scenario. We deal with amendments almost immediately with regard to changing circumstances that happen from time to time, not the least of which is projects that roll over from year to year. I would tell you that if you were to look at the budget message I gave you a year ago at this time of year compared to the budget message I just gave you Monday night, you would see a difference of about $18 million in terms of the dollars that I quoted in the opening paragraphs of each of those messages. And so you were definitely going to find differences. Having done the math with respect to the two numbers and that $18 million, you will find that 80 to 88% of that is attributed to the difference in capital from year to year. And so when you look at a $147 million budget here, and then of course the $165 million budget that I'm asking for your support of, I'm also telling you that 80% of that is going to be tied to capital that you do over between the 2 years, the difference in the capital agenda and so on. In this particular circumstance, I would also tell you that the balance of that, at least as it relates to the proposed budget that we have in front of you right now, you're going to see operational differences of about $2 million. And as you're going to see here in a little bit, that is made up in the lion's share with respect to the COLAs that we're suggesting, with respect to the step movements that we're suggesting as well, and some of the other features that we will find in the collective bargaining agreement that we've worked out with the union. So the reality is, if you wanted to try to reconcile the proposed budget to what it is that we passed in July of last year, the biggest bang for your buck is going to come in the form of capital projects that you may decide not to do. Because that indeed will bring those numbers back down pretty rapidly. Because I really don't want to see us not do raises for employees over the next.
Go ahead, Bruce.
Do you mind giving us a latitude when we're going through this, instead of waiting until the end to ask all our questions as you bring things up? Do you mind if we ask you about those?
Absolutely.
Okay,
that
so
would be just fine.
in other words, while we're
You bet.
talking about the capital, investment, we're going up to 165 million. How much of that, if any, is tied to the Casper Business Center?
Fair question, and yes, please, if you have questions organically, I would be pleased to answer them. So
Thank you.
Thank you for that question. The Casper Business Center was purchased, as we all know, just a few weeks ago, and that will be ratified by virtue of budget amendment number 3 that you will have in front of you, I think on the 7th, or is it the 21st?
It comes to council for approval on the 21st, but there's a work session on the 2nd.
In between.
But it's
Okay,
an
great.
amendment for 2022.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
That's right. And so, as you know, that adds $8 million of funds that we are obviously exercising for that purchase. And that, of course, would add to this right here, as a matter of fact, once you pass it, of course. And just so you know, right now, your current 22 budget is actually closer to the neighborhood of 189 million right now, based on all the projects that we've rolled forward from previous years, with the hope, of course, that they get done and spent in full in fiscal year 22. So as it relates to fiscal year 23, Councilman, the dollars that we will spend are really only tied to the design work that will be conducted in fiscal year 23. And that, as you remember, probably is closer to the $2 million range, which is included in the prospectus for fiscal year 23. Or is it a 22 feature? It's a 22 feature. Okay, thank you. Obviously, the largest portion of activity related to that will be in fiscal year 23.
And that'll come by the way of amendments, I'm assuming, when we start the work on the building.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Now, for fiscal year 24, if everything works out right, hopefully we'll have a proposal in front of you this time next year that includes that capital.
Right.
As it relates to that rework of that building, and that could be obviously kind of expensive. So So be mindful of that. Okay?
Thank you.
You bet. Thank you. So anyways, that's just kind of a feel for what our budgets have looked like over time. And without a doubt, I stand by my contention that generally speaking, operations are not really the biggest driving factor in terms of some of those differences. It's 90% of the time capital that will push those differences. Moving forward then, let's start talking about the general fund. The general fund for me is one of those funds that I worry about the most because it is the fund that tends to be the hardest to plan for. It's not a fund that you get to set rates for as a council like you do in your enterprises. And as you will see here in just a second, when it comes to sales and use taxes, that is a very volatile funding source for the general fund. It happens to be the breadbasket, if you will. We're anticipating the general fund being made up of about $20 million in sales tax revenue. And so, you know, it bears some discussion this evening. But when you're looking at a volatile resource like the sales tax program is in the state of Wyoming, it makes the opportunity to plan the general fund's activity over the next year very challenging and hard to predict sometimes and so on. This here is actually the fiscal year 21 actual receipts for sales and use taxes, and like I said, you can see wide variability as it relates to a season of collections for sales and use taxes. Fiscal year 21 certainly not very different in that regard. Fiscal year 22, the actuals that we've received so far is what you're seeing here in this red trend line. These are actual dollars that the city has received so far. Obviously, we've got a little more to go here as far as that last month of collections is concerned. As it relates to some of the other features of sales taxes as we are considering this revenue source, the purple line here is actually what we budgeted for fiscal year 22. And as you can see, we had some successes, obviously, as indicated by the green bars here, and some that we didn't quite hit the mark on, as indicated by the light pink bars, where it didn't quite meet budget. But the good news is, on the whole, so far, we are in a surplus margin of just under 2% right now. Hopefully that improves over the next month. I don't think so. And accordingly, that 1.5 to 2% margin was what we used to try to budget for fiscal year 23 as far as sales and use taxes go. The budget that you have in front of you actually suggests a 3.82% increase over what it is that we think we're going to get in the form of actuals. Again, this kind of maroon bar for the remainder of this fiscal year. So if you consider the fact that we are anticipating about a 2% margin to good for this fiscal year, we are suggesting adding on top of that what you see in the form of the blue dotted line here for fiscal year 23. And again, that's about a 3.82% growth factor. If you wanted to see how that looks on a 1/12 demonstration of the budget being proposed for this revenue category, that's what this line is here for, right here. I would tell you that factor is actually somewhere in the middle of what it is that we read in the form of data to prepare for this question. I believe the Craig report suggested somewhere in the neighborhood of a 5 to 5+% factor. Wham actually suggested the 3.82 with regard to the studies and data that they have access to. We decided to go with a more conservative figure. We didn't think we needed to stick with the current projection moving into the next fiscal year, in that I do think some inflationary pressure is going to have some benefit as it relates to receipts that we actually receive in the form of the sales and use taxes. Now, I'll also tell you, though, that we do anticipate some growth in some of the other general fund revenues as well. Direct distribution, for example, was very favorable for us this fiscal year compared to last. We are anticipating a growth of about $600,000 over the next fiscal year, if I remember correctly, in that category, which is very favorable for us. You'll recall, however, I don't exactly like using direct distribution in our operations. But at this point, we really don't have a revenue replacement strategy that would be adequate to wean that out of the operations of the general fund. Another general fund operational revenue stream that is positive for us right now is the property taxes. I do think with respect to the rates that have been increased through the assessor's office, that's going to have some positive effect as it relates to general fund operations as well. Particularly as we keep our rates static. I think there will be some increase with regard to the operations that the city gains through that revenue stream. I would tell you that as it relates to the building permit revenue stream that the general fund has in its portfolio, we are not anticipating an aggressive growth in that category. I happen to think that we will see some positive growth, but I didn't really have a lot of data that suggested that that would be the case, and so we decided to stay more conservative than perhaps what our hunch was, because the data just didn't really point to a lot of windfall in that regard. So that's another larger revenue category in the general fund that in this case we did not see any growth in. Franchise fees, as I mentioned in your narrative, has the potential to be a growth feature in the general fund's revenue portfolio. However, we didn't build a lot in that either. I think, unfortunately for our ratepayers in the community, we likely will see rates go up because inflationary pressures are so strong right now. It seems to me inevitable that the like the electric producers, for example, won't approach the regulatory commission for some sort of rate increase over the next year. We, however, did not build any growth in that category, however, and I wouldn't recommend it until we do see some type of movement on the regulatory commission that would provide for that. So in the absence of that data, although our hunches are pretty strong that that will occur, we did not try to inflate that revenue stream. To talk about sales and use taxes a little more, to dissect it some more, this is a longer, sort of broader view with respect to sales taxes over time. This analysis goes back to July of 15, as you can see here. We did drop a trend line on there, and you can see that there is some slow upward growth of this revenue over time, despite what we experienced during the pandemic period here. For the most part, our budget comes in right about here as it relates to where we think sales and use tax is going to go over time, over the next year in particular. To dissect this a little further, as you see sales tax history for the general fund on an even broader cross-cut of time, if you will, you probably are noticing, like I have, that this tends to be sort of a cyclical approach over time. I think we are probably, here as it relates to what we experience here in Natrona County and with the city of Casper. And so hopefully this trend, at least continues through the next year and maybe one more year before we see a drop like we see in other parts of this curve. And if you were to extend that out even further. So I don't think that we're outside of of what we typically experience here with respect to the prediction that we're trying to make at this point in our next fiscal year, in preparation for our next fiscal year. But certainly the purpose of this discussion and meeting and so on is to try to challenge these assumptions if you think the need is there to do so. Moving into sort of a broader review of sales taxes, we looked at the cross-cut throughout the county, and you can see what the major industries are doing right now and where they're going. I'm encouraged to some degree by the upward, orientation of these categories. Obviously, some are more profound than others. Hopefully that portends to this continuing at least over the next year, perhaps even into FY24, as far as it relates to retail in particular, being more productive for the city of Casper. Without a doubt, as we all know, particularly given the volatility that sales tax can have, we could see some pressure that would force these trajectories into a flat or even downward position over the next year. I certainly hope that won't be the case. But the indicators to me are more positive than they are negative. Again, hence the reason I'm coming to you with a kind of a midland approach to projecting sales taxes for the general fund over the next year. Let's move into the general fund, unless there's other questions about revenue for the general fund we can entertain.
Any questions, Ricardo?
Okay, breaking down the general fund a little further. You are all aware, pursuant to a conversation we just had just a few weeks ago, that by virtue of the audit that was completed and with some of the positive spending that we've seen in the general fund over the last couple of years, we have a balance of this that we started the fiscal year with. You'll recall, however, that as we, of course, build our revenues that we are discussing here, this right here would be reflective of the direct distribution number, which, as you can tell, does look much more positive than what it's been in the past, and hopefully this is a reflection of what we'll see over the next biennium versus just fiscal 23 alone. Comparing that to our expenses that we're envisioning for the next fiscal year, this, you can't quite tell what that says, but see if I can help that a little bit. Thank you. We're anticipating new positions to be in the form of this combined value, if you will, if you're willing to consider reclassified positions as being a new position approach. Let's go ahead and refer to your memos that we have on this topic, and we can try to answer any questions that makes up this number for the general fund and the $655,000 that we're talking about for the enterprises. Because you basically, in total, have, and this is the memo I'm looking at right here for those of you who may be wondering what I'm referring to. The total request then, of course, is the combined value of the 655 plus the 229 or 224, that range of general fund figures here. For the general fund, this really is only a request for 3 positions. And if you look at your memo, mine is a little more profoundly colored than yours. The general fund positions are shaded in kind of an off yellow, almost beige, if you will. So if you hold it right in the light and look a little more closely, you'll be able to see what I'm talking about. Just to give you an example, one of the new changes that we talked about earlier in the calendar year was with regard to staffing a police officer in the municipal court for security purposes during court and so on. That's reflected in that $91,000. Another example would be the Parks and Rec worker 2 in athletics for a cost of the general fund of $63,900. And then the last position that we're requesting for the general fund is actually a split position between PSCC and the police department. which are two different funds technically, for the police accreditation specialist that we'd be bringing on in FY23 if this budget passes. The non-shaded positions are enterprise impacted positions. And Weed and Pest is not an enterprise fund, but it is another fund. It's funded through the Weed and Pest mill that the city gets through the county. And so it has no impact on the general fund or the enterprises for that matter, to a cost of $63,900. The aquatics position, if you approve, is actually a coordinator position in the aquatics cost center, and that would be funded through the aquatics fund, and would be made up in the subsidy that comes over from 1%. You obviously have the authority to determine whether or not that subsidy continues to come over. And as we get more into the discussion of subsidies and so on, you'll remember that subsidy is not new, although that figure is a little more this year than we've anticipated in the last couple of years. So we're talking $325 compared to $375, if you approve. The bail fill, we've talked about these positions a little bit in the when we went through the utility discussions back in November and so on. Most of these positions, particularly for the bail fill, are positions that are revenue generating, and I would tell you that therefore they are not a net impact of nothing if in fact the revenue projections that we're predicting come to pass with these services that these positions will be expanding for the customers of our fund. For those of you that sit on the regional water board, some of this discussion may be familiar to you as it relates to the operators. The supervisor position is actually an enhanced position. We don't plan to backfill that person who's promoted into that role. But if you look at entry number 9, that is a brand new operator position that we're proposing for that operation out there. And as you'll remember, the operation of that plant is done with city employees, but actually governed by the board, a number of those members of which are among all of you. The far less costly aspect of this is with regard to some of the reclasses we're doing if our budget passes here. And as you can see, for the general fund, that is less than $6,000. So I would tell you that, in my opinion, that's a real good way to get some additional assistance, more technical assistance, if you will, in a fairly low-cost approach. So that is the agenda that we're looking for as it relates to employees for fiscal year 23. And I'd be happy to entertain any questions with the help of our department heads here today, should you have any.
Amber.
For the additional sworn officer to backfill the muni court position, do you anticipate that being a temporary position once we move operations and whatnot over to the other building, or do you anticipate that being a forever position?
Mr. Mayor, council member, that's a great question. I do anticipate that being technically an increase for the PD sworn by 1. So while it is a backfill proposal that we're talking about, the PD will supply us a security person from now on, regardless of what building court ends up being in.
Lisa.
I know that before we've talked before about a grant writer. Do you see any kind of need to add a grant writer into? I know Jill's staff is pretty bogged down with all of that. So somebody that could like just do mostly grants?
Mr. Mayor, Councilwoman, one of the prevailing themes in this budget is undoubtedly a more aggressive approach to using dollars that we do have on hand to leverage as match dollars, larger grants coming into the organization so we can get other projects done, we can get buildings done, and those kinds of things. It would be very helpful if we had a person dedicated full-time to writing grants and helping us secure those dollars and so on. And so I would like to be there at some point in time, but I'm not ready to make that proposal for fiscal year 23. I would suggest, however, that with respect to the position that we have reformatted and repurposed out of the PD into finance, that we're getting part of the way there in terms of the follow-up that's needed for our grant writing that we currently do, and the reporting and some of the SEPA things that we need to pay better attention to in our audit process. So while we're getting there to some degree, I think a new position would help us get to the next level of procuring more money for the organization to use. But I'm not ready to ask for that yet. I appreciate that question though, because it sets the table very nicely for next year.
Next year is ready. Well, as a follow-up though, is I do believe that if you had somebody who specialized in grants, I believe that that position could actually pay for itself.
I agree.
And then it would also free up Jill and her team to do other things that they're needing to do. And so a grant writer they're worth their weight in gold, so.
I couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more.
Kyle and then Jack.
Thanks, Mayor. I guess real quick as a follow-up to Councilwoman Engebretsen's comments, I thought I saw somewhere a grant specialist position in Liz's department, didn't I? Okay.
You did. As a matter of fact, in
Might be
that
new,
top
but-
entry, let's see, where did we go? I'm sorry. It's a reclass, thank you. Yep, at the bottom.
I see.
Thank you, that's right. Liz, do you mind describing that for a touch for that 5-2 that we're talking about?
Your
If that's
Honor,
okay, Mr. Mayor?
You bet.
Members of council, that position is a reclassification. Currently, the position exists as an administrative assistant, and that is Pam Jones. And so with all of the work that she took on with the transit operation and the numerous grants that we are applying for, many of them are new, as the city manager will explain, with one of them being with Homeland Security and TSA for security parking. We did decide to reclass that position up because it has assumed much more responsibility with the transit operation. And then that position works hand in hand, or hand in glove, with the finance department to make sure that we're in compliance. So that's the reclass.
Pam's got enough to do. Her grants are exclusive to the transit program, though?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Excellent question.
And then my primary question was, I don't remember ever seeing it in the regional water minutes. Could you give me a brief rundown of the operator? Do we not have a current operator? Is there like an additional one that's needed for, covering? Just curious to learn a little bit more.
Yeah, no problem, Mr. Mayor. The answer to your couple questions there is yes. We do have operators. We do have differing levels of expertise as it relates to the operators on hand. We're talking about bringing on an operator that essentially would help to offset some of the issues that we have when people go on vacation and we don't have enough operators to man the station 24 hours a day. Andrew, do you want to give a little more insight, if I could, Mr. Mayor?
Carter, Mayor, members of council, Carter's got that pretty well accurate. Whenever we have somebody sick or on vacation, it's the maintenance side that falls by the wayside, because if we pull them to operate the plant, that plant runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. It's manned all the time. So it really is a position that we can now concentrate more on maintenance, not necessarily operations, because we always have to operate the plant, but it's to prevent the ongoing deferred maintenance at the facility.
Thank you. I do remember reading that in the minutes now that you've mentioned it, so I appreciate it.
Try to take care of Steve. Is this?
Because it's
Yeah,
it's
go
in
ahead.
with that.
Yeah, go ahead.
And basically, Kyle, that winds up being billed back to the regional water system. So in essence, it is a new city employee, but the city doesn't have to pay for it, so to speak. The regional water system pays for that employee through the joint billing that we get sent on a monthly basis. Because the water board gets a bill from the city to operate that plant every month, and that employee's salary will be in that bill back to the water plant.
Thank you.
Jai.
So just as a follow-up to Lisa's question about the grant writer, when you say you're not ready, is that like a process? Is it not being ready kind of in the system, like with the space for somebody to fill that, or the plan or the strategy, or is it a fiscal unreadiness? Like, where does that come from?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, great question. And I would say probably all the above is the reason we're not quite ready for that. I would rather have a much more detailed layout of what it is that we're going to do in the form of pursuing grants and how the pieces and parts of those grants will actually pay for the position, as Councilwoman Ingebretson alluded to. And so that business plan for that position is not put together, and nor am I convinced that that position will be a net zero proposal to the general fund. So until that argument is built right and that case is made on the internal level, I wouldn't feel comfortable bringing it forward until then.
Thank you.
Amber.
Thank you. Carter, I remember in the last budget process, we had approved 2 communications positions, I believe. One that was going to be funded through MPO and one that would be funded elsewhere. Is this communication position in addition to that, or have we only hired the one since last budget, and this is that second one that we'd already sort of talked about?
Great question, Mr. Mayor. Council member, your memory is correct. The MPO side of this equation is actually a little different than what we talked about last year. Those 2 positions that you're referring to are a mixture of payment between the CPU side, sanitation side, and the general fund. And as many of you have met Rachel, she is the upshot of that effort, and we're about to release the next job description for the second person very soon. And so you will see that second person coming online, although obviously not before probably the end of this current fiscal year, as we had initially discussed.
Okay.
The MPO side of this is actually something that we have put together with regard to recommendations through FTA and that respective business plan, as well as the increasing expectation that the feds have with regard to, you know, an ambitious public engagement model that they're really pushing out to their grant recipients. And so for us, it's an absolute must to have that person helping us, because that public engagement side of things through the FTA monies is becoming increasingly more and more important.
Anything
Would
else?
you add anything to that, Liz, or does that cover it?
Beautifully.
Thank you.
You're good, Carter. You can keep going.
All right. Any other questions about employees or positions, new positions? Moving along, then, that's what it looks like for the general fund. Most of the enterprises, as you will see, already have those anticipated, and that's mostly by virtue of what we've talked about since November. However, let's talk a little bit more
Carter,
about.
can you hold on 1 second?
Sorry.
Amber.
Sorry, no problem.
Sorry, I
Yes,
missed
no problem.
Missed the deadline on that one. Can you, I read in a memo about the police accreditation specialist, but can you provide a little, or maybe Chief can provide a little bit more clarity as to like how that would benefit the department, why it's needed at this juncture, and we haven't had it in the past, et cetera.
Let me set the table briefly and then turn that remainder of that question to the Chief. You all have been very good supporters of the police department becoming accredited. And I think that that has a lot of value in terms of where we need to go as an organization, and in terms of some of the other things that we will hopefully avoid from now on as it relates to maintaining folks' civil rights and the right training that we need, and so on. The chief is willing to represent to you tonight that if indeed we can't have someone who helps us maintain that effort from here on out as an accredited organization, which I hope to do with the fire department as well as we move into the new leadership of that department, then we likely won't be able to maintain the rigor that's necessary for all the reporting and following up and making sure we're living up to what we said we would do as a part of that process. Chief, would you care to add anything to that?
I think it's important, Mayor, Council, I think it's important to also point out, you know, we fully anticipate, crossing our fingers, that we will be accredited here in the coming months. That is the lowest level of accreditation, still a significant accomplishment. However, we've set our goals much higher. We're aiming for advanced accreditation. And we've been doing this as a team effort with some contracted assistance to help us achieve this very lofty goal. But moving forward into achieving that higher level of accreditation, there's no way to do that the way that we've been kind of hodgepodging it to get this far. We would submit to you that this is, as was earlier indicated, some positions pay for themselves, and it's hard to quantify that, but we would already submit to you that our lawsuits that have been brought against the city have been diminishing rapidly through these efforts to further professionalize the department. So to achieve that, you know, we are doing double and triple duty in some areas, and only kind of getting by. To actually achieve our goals, we need that full-time position, and certainly to achieve that higher goal, it would require the new FTE.
Would the hiring of this person then end up saving money in the long run by doing away with any contractual people that you're bringing in to get you where you're at now? Or do you still have to have that on top of it?
Mayor, Councilman, excellent question. No, we would no longer need that contractual person. We're paying them less because we're not paying them salary and benefits, but we would recover that $35,000 that we're paying them on an annual basis. We would recover that and fold it back into this. And so in the end, we believe this is appropriate and a good deal for the department.
So one more question. The person that you have under contract now, are they not capable of getting you to the advanced accreditation?
Mayor, Council, they're certainly capable, but that requires more time than, you know, they have the capacity but not the time. They are a full-time accreditation manager for a very large organization. This is a part-time contractual opportunity for them, and there's just not enough hours in the week.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Thanks, Mayor. Sorry, Chief, you opened the door. You mentioned history of lawsuits. I wonder, is that information we already have put together? And if so, I'd just be curious to see it. You know, lawsuits over the decades or years.
Mayor, you know, great question. So there's always a delay in those lawsuits. So they have, you know, in some cases years before they have to file those or give us notice of those lawsuits. But what we can tell you is anecdotally, those are not coming in like with the frequency that they were a few years ago.
Thank you. Chief Cap.
Back, excuse me, back to your accreditation. If that company had the time, I'm assuming that it would take more time than what they've been spending to get us to that next level. Therefore, that $35K that we've been spending now would probably increase some? Or would they be able to get us, if they had the time, to that next level with the same $35K expenditure on our part?
Mayor, you know, that's an excellent question. Here, I will stand before you and say it's not possible. It is not possible. To get to where we need to be. We need boots on the ground here with knowledge of our organization to help us maintain these things. Over the period of the last week, I think I have personally approved and made the final edits on some probably 15 critical policies in the department. That in conjunction with political rallies and critical incidents, we do not have the capacity to do it. So this person is providing X amount of hours to us. We are filling in the gap with the services of people that don't have that time to spare anymore. To achieve that higher level, I've been in the accreditation business now for more than 25 years. I know of no agency out there that doesn't have a dedicated person full-time that has been able to achieve that higher advanced accreditation.
Thank you.
Anything else?
Mr. Mayor, I might add too, the chief kind of alluded to this, the time that his people will save, picking up these pieces and parts of those responsibilities currently, in my opinion, would be added to at least the indirect costs of trying to do it the way we're doing it now. And so folks like the deputy chief and the chief and some of the other lieutenants and captains that pitch in and help and do what they can to keep things moving would all be saved, and that to me is pretty compelling.
Mayor,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I will be very brief. I neglected to mention, as Carter informed you, part of the expenses of this is being attributed to the PSCC, and it's our absolute stated goal to also accredit our PSCC. And so bringing in that knowledge that we really lack is a critical portion of it. But we're going to be not only the only police agency accredited in Wyoming, we'll also have the only accredited dispatch also.
All right, any other questions then? Anything else I can deal with from a position standpoint at all? Okay. So to continue our discussion of the general fund and how this kind of a balance sheet works out, if you will, I'd like to address this a little further. And this is not going to be a surprise to you, given some of the recent discussions we just had here with all of you. Let's skip that for now. There we go. We balance, that's the basic reason for this entry here. But as you all know, with regard to the dollars we set aside for the sinking fund, that of course deteriorates our standing cash balance that we're currently enjoying as a part of the equity of the general fund to a new number more along the lines of this right here. So that means as this fund is being set apart by virtue of the passage of the fiscal year 23 budget, this is probably more what you can expect as a residual balance in the general fund as compared to this, of course. And so while I still believe this is the right thing to do in order to keep up with our obligations to Fire Fund A, it's obviously very expensive. Not as expensive, however, as it would be if we tried to pay everything right now in year one for that statutory obligation. So we are saving money, but it's still an expensive proposal. And obviously without that, establishing this sinking fund would be unlikely. Okay? So this really is the layout of the general fund, the nuts and bolts of the cash flow that we're expecting over the next fiscal year. I'd like to dive into this entry a little further if I could, however. Yes, we did talk about this a few months back, but I'd like to go through that again so that we can review that data and kind of refresh our memories, if you will, of what this actually entails. And so if I could get that chart brought up, or do you want to go back to that slide? Let's see. I'll go backwards. Okay, here we go. This chart's going to look about familiar to you. We're bringing up a dynamic chart here so we can talk about some of the variables in more detail. Again, this chart looks familiar to you because this is the same sort of instrument that we used a couple months ago to evaluate COLAs and evaluate step increases and that kind of thing. Just to remind you, we have built into your budget that you're looking at right now, with respect to the activity that the general fund just displayed, the variables that you see here. So that includes a COLA for our employees at this rate. It includes a step increase for those employees, the general government employees that are eligible at this rate. And also, as you look at the PD, there are a number of employees that are eligible for a 5% step increase in their operation. You all recognize and understand that as it relates to the fire department, there's some features that also include steps and a COLA, but there's also that parity figure included in this number that you see here. This title is a little confusing. Don't let that totally confuse the discussion, but indeed the figure that you see here includes the parity, it includes the COLA, it includes those that are eligible for step increases in the department as well. And so, any other major features I'm missing there in that calculation? Okay. So when you consider the total of these figures as it relates to the general fund in particular, that's where you get this figure at the bottom. $2.1 million is really what we're talking about for employees in the organization in the general fund. As you consider the enterprises and so on, that obviously adds to that figure, but on the whole, I think it's the right thing to do, and I think the movement we've discussed provisionally by this point is still the appropriate thing to do, particularly given where we're at with inflation and those kinds of things.
Is it generally acceptable to give a raise and a COLA at the same time to the tune of 8.5%?
I would say that the feature that is typically missing, Mr. Mayor, if I could, is this figure here. COLAs are far more rare than a regular sort of increase in a person's wage band, if you will. And that's what steps typically represent.
Because a COLA is a one-time.
Right. And they typically are only in response to local conditions that would warrant that.
Well, considering inflation and everything the way it's going, 8.5% may seem like a lot. It's probably not, but that's a pretty nice little jump for anybody. 8.5%, it's a really big jump actually, and it just seems like a lot considering the times we're in right now. I don't know.
Sure.
I'm just speaking out loud.
Yeah.
So, and it's not that I don't want them to have it, but 8.5% is a huge raise considering we just gave them one last year as well. So they're looking at a lot of them would be looking at a 13.5% increase in 18 calendar months, right?
Well, if I may add some data to that, I know there's some other questions here. Keep in mind that with respect to the activities that the council approved back in, I'm going to say January, February timeframe, that was for a limited amount of personnel who hadn't gotten an increase in probably 2 or so years. And so from that standpoint, many viewed those actions as being kind of a make-up position, if you will, for those who hadn't gotten raises, and where many others may have. This is a way more comprehensive approach, undoubtedly, therefore more expensive, in that it casts a broader net with respect to the employees that this would impact this time around. And again, I would tell you, doesn't typically include a COLA. I mean, that is fair to say. And so that does add to the expense, without a doubt. But you know, I would hope that step increases can continue to be a feature even if COLAs aren't necessarily in FY24 and 25 and so on.
Carter, when was the last time the city employees got a COLA?
The last time city employees got a COLA, Mr. Mayor, was in FY18, if I remember correctly, and it was a 2% rate back then. And so that would have been it.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Okay. Let's see. I can't think of anything else I want to necessarily point out in this demonstration. Let's go ahead and move then into enterprises.
Hold on one second, Steve.
Okay, no problem.
Actually, of the city employees, the wage adjustments, how many employees does that actually affect?
That is a fair question. We believe, and Tracy can correct me if I get my information wrong, we believe that 62 people in the organization, by virtue of their position on their respective wage band, will receive $900 or less over the next year, if you know, obviously if this is approved. And so there are a few folks who this portion of the recommendation will not impact as beneficially as this might otherwise indicate.
Well, and that's why I was asking that, is basically, I know Bruce brought up the 8.5% increase, but really we're talking about all 512 will get the 3.5, but yet only 67 would wind up with 8.5.
Actually, I want to flip that around on you a little bit. Only 62 employees will receive far less than this. I mean, less than $1,000 a year. So the balance of the 62 employees and the rest of the organization will likely actually come close to receiving something like this.
Okay.
If that makes sense. I'm sorry I got that confused.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to make sure that we weren't thinking that everybody was winding up with an 8.5% increase.
Well, all but 62 will.
Right.
Yes, that's what I was saying. 62 out of 512 will wind up with that.
No,
Well-
no.
The other way.
All of them but 62 will get 8.5%.
All but 62.
All but 62.
Right.
Those 62 will receive a little bit less than that.
Okay.
And I should clarify that's non-union as well.
Right, and I don't want to, I want to be clear, our employees are our greatest asset, so I'm certainly not looking to cut them by any means. My question simply was, is that acceptable, is it normal to give an 8.5% raise in a year based on the fact that we just gave 5% to some of them the year before?
Right.
Well, not, in this calendar year, actually.
This calendar year.
Yeah, so some employees are going to be looking at a 13.5% increase in their pay in one calendar year. That's pretty nice. That's unheard of generally as a businessman, and so that's where it's coming from me.
Sure.
So,
I guess I would argue, because I understand where Bruce is coming from, but I would also argue the conversations we've been having for us to compete with other businesses that are raising their rates to $18 an hour, $20 an hour, those things, and where I know I've had conversations with Carter where it's hard to get some employees to be, coming and being a part of that. And so I think for us to remain competitive as well is going to be important. And so I think while I understand some of the trepidation that Bruce is saying, I think we have to remain competitive. I think we have to show that we have to be invested into our employees to create that. So it's tough. I know it's a tough deal.
and I don't mind doing it,
Yeah.
especially with our employees, but what that makes me want to say then is we should probably find some other areas where we're pretty fat, and we are, where we could maybe cut back a little bit so we could take better care of our employees, because we're pretty fat in some areas. So,
Yeah.
I also think we should make sure we're clear in how we distinguish between the two. It's not really, the 3.5 is not a raise. The 5%, when we're looking at a step adjustment, that is to improve the financial position of every employee that we have. The 3.5 is to just help maintain the financial position that they already had based on our current market conditions. So, I think we should make sure we're clear when we're talking about one or the other, because the 3.5% is going to be absorbed entirely by current market conditions. So it's not really a improvement in anybody's like standard of living or anything like that. So separate them, I think.
Fair point. Mr. Mayor, I think Tracy wanted to add something if I could.
Mayor, council members, I don't know, I might confuse the whole thing. It's pretty dynamic. So when we're talking, everybody get an 8.5% increase, that's not true, because some people get promoted in between the times. So if a 5%, we're looking at 5% total if you were to grant such a thing. So if somebody recently got promoted, there might be a difference that they get, that they got a 3% increase in the past 6 months, so to speak. You know, so we're trying to make it as equitable as possible for those who did already get a increase in pay. Only 39% of our employees got a pay increase in January, which was the third implementation of the phase with the rate study. And so this is the final thing that we said that we would look at getting all the employees something with this budget preparation. So that's why we're looking at that market adjustment. So just to keep that in mind too, that it's kind of been a long-term phase-in approach that we were trying to look at with the rates implementation. So that is part of the reason. So we do have also 14 employees that would not receive a COLA and 22 employees that would not receive a market adjustment because of their placement already on the pay scale where it is with the movement. So it's really hard to just do this blanket, everybody gets this. It really depends on the situation and what their placement and everything is currently in the classification. So hopefully that clarifies and doesn't confuse it.
Amber.
So are you saying when somebody is at the upper end of their pay scale, the fact that we have decided to sort of shift the whole thing by 3.5% with a COLA doesn't actually change what their defined pay scale is? So once you're maxed out, you're maxed out, unless we do another study
on most employees, if you do a COLA, it will shift it forward, so it gives that gap, depending on where you're at. We do have a few employees that are already at the max or even beyond the max. Mm-hmm. We have, I think, one employee that comes to mind that is beyond the max and has been. And so it won't shift out far enough for them to get any increase. And so there's that situation.
So when does under what conditions would the range move? Only if we did another grade study to recalibrate the entire thing, or
the range moves 3.5%.
Okay, I got you. But for some they're already closer than that 3.5%.
Yeah.
Okay, I understand.
And so there are things like reclassifications that gets in a position to a higher grade, which then has, the longer maximum where they are, so they have that income potential with that. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa.
Yeah.
All right, so the entry that you're seeing in the general fund worksheet is not 2.6. When you add these figures in, that's what you get here. The entry that you're seeing in the general fund worksheet is actually more of a sum of these numbers up here, just to be clear. So, okay. All right. Any other questions then before we move on? Okay. Moving back then to our worksheets, let's go ahead and go into the enterprises. While we have talked about the enterprises far more than we've talked about the general fund up until now, I do think there's some things that we want to review just to be sure you're clear as to how the cash flow activity looks in the enterprise funds as well. Water distribution, for example. You can see that as it relates to the beginning of fiscal year 30, this is the cash balance that we're anticipating pertaining to the activity, both from a revenue standpoint, primarily made up of rates, 1% comes in right here in what we call non-operating revenue. That's an infusion that you have authorized through 1% 16. Compared to the expenses, we do anticipate a reduction in equity, if you will, by this amount. And so, moving forward here, we then get to retain this amount in the fund's equity, which is obviously less than what you see here, but not unanticipated. Council has taken the position that not every capital dollar and so forth needs to be made up through capital expenses that aren't covered through 1 cent by virtue of the health of the fund. And obviously that's a biennium to biennium decision that council considers every time. So that indeed, when you see what happens with regard to, okay, let me skip this for just a second. The performance of this blue line, if you will, as it relates to the performance of the fund overall, you basically are buying down over time this positive balance to support more aggressive capital in any given year. Otherwise, if you were to not do that, of course, this would continue to perform way up here, and that may not be appropriate as it relates to citizens' rates and those kinds of things. So, nonetheless, this is where your ending balance is going to be as of fiscal year 23. I would have you always keep an eye, however, on what goes on out here, even though this is a few years out. Certainly, as you get closer down the continuum here, you're going to see this activity kind of vary back and forth over time. Keeping an eye on that obviously is important, maybe not as important in the water fund, but certainly as you're talking about the bail fill and the sanitation funds, it becomes much more important because, as you know, we have to fund the creation of new landfill cells and so on. Again, not necessarily as critical unless you want to be more aggressive in terms of the water lines and other features the water system requires to be maintained as you progress through the years that you keep an eye on. That will always impact things, particularly as you get further and further above what's actually provided through 1 cent here. Since we're talking about 1 cent, let's talk about for a second what happens in the water distribution fund if in fact 1 cent does not come to pass in November. And this is just a reality of what indeed happens, because basically these revenues go away for the most part, and unless we change our capital scheme and agenda to offset those revenues, then of course we deal with a much different bottom line proposal. Okay, so looking at that again, this is the fund equity we get to retain moving past fiscal year 23, and without 1 cent. Without 1 cent, obviously that looks quite a bit different as far as the cash balance that the water fund gets to work with. Now, as you know, with that type of activity not changing, revenue not coming in, expenses from a capital standpoint needing to be maintained at a flat level, the condition here gets worse and worse without those infusions of revenues or changes in our expense appetite for capital. So let's go ahead and switch to the pro forma so that we can see what that looks like. This is the one we just saw, right? There's our position at the end of fiscal year 23. If we take out this aspect of our portfolio, even for just a couple years, you can see what happens pretty rapidly.
Well, the reality is, then we're no longer subsidizing that fund. We're going to have to raise rates. It's just that simple. So.
Unless we just don't replace water lines, right? Or contribute to the water treatment plant, or whatever. And that can be a tough approach to take when you're managing a water system that's as complex as ours. So yeah, we would have to massage the rates, and even at that kind of jump, look what happens. The recovery still becomes slower to obtain. So let's go back to the original pro forma.
Carter, while, sorry.
No, go ahead.
While we're on the subject, so is it safe to say, just based on what Jill was just doing there, that even at a 25% rate increase, that fund would continue to diminish over time? Was that what I was seeing?
Even at a 25% increase, and that was just 1 year, Mr. Mayor,
Of removing,
With
yeah,
the
so it's
Right.
more drastic?
with that being gone. So I would say 25% would be probably a pattern that you would need to sustain over time until you can get that operating condition back in a stable mode.
Well, and that's the kind of information that needs to be put out
Yep,
in the 1 cent stuff.
pretty much just about to say that.
Exactly what has to be done, because if people don't understand that, and their ideology is, oh, well, if we don't pass the 1 cent, then they're just going to jack our rates. Well, the reality is we don't have a choice,
Yeah.
or you're not going to have water to drink. I mean, it's pretty simple.
Well, and if we could go back to that 25%, I know I just told you, I'm
That's
sorry,
all right.
Jill, don't hate me. You can see what happens over here as far as the sort of average residential impact is. You gotta get the,
I don't think that increases.
oh, it's here, I'm sorry, yep. Those rates these rates will be reflective really, really quickly of what happens pursuant to what goes on over there. It just substantially, 25% means something all of a sudden for a typical residential customer. Other questions about the water fund? Let's go ahead and switch back.
Anything else for Carter? Pat?
Thank you, Mayor. It's not specifically about the water fund, but I'm thinking about, we got grilled a little bit the other week when we first started talking about proposed budget because the expenses were above and beyond the revenue. Is it a combination of instances like this where our aggressive capital plan are drawing down those balances in some of these enterprise funds, but not, but is that how we end up in that situation where we have more expenses than revenues? Is that we're just drawing down our balances on some of those for an aggressive capital?
That is precisely, Mr. Mayor, what that is reflective of. We're buying down those balances, and or we're doing capital projects based on cash balances that are available. So the Opportunity Fund is a very good example. You'll notice here soon that we're anticipating an $856,000 spend out of the Opportunity Fund. That is without offsetting revenue. And so that 856 contributes to what appears to be an imbalance, and I would say is inappropriately described as an imbalance, because indeed the money is there. We are not doing capital without cash on hand to do it. And even though it might mean buying down what it looks like in the pro forma from that positive cash balance to, reducing our fund equity, it doesn't mean, in my opinion, that it is an imbalance with respect to the way that the budget has been designed. So you've hit the nail right on the head with that description.
Thank you.
Anything else?
All right, so let's move on to sewer. The sewer fund is a much smaller fund and therefore not exactly akin to what you see with the water fund, given that it's such a bigger fund. But a lot of the same sort of dynamics exist. With respect to this kind of activity, obviously we're having a much different impact with regard to the remaining equity that's available for this fund. However, you have anticipated this with respect to the to the trajectory that you're familiar with here, we recognize that we're going to be in this area for a little while. I would tell you that if by the end of this fiscal year, this position looks different, worse, or whatever you want to call it, for fiscal year 23, that's a pretty positive equity position. We would need to recommend something different than what we have so far in order to try to better help this blue line perform a little better. And that, of course, comes in the form of rates or doing less capital. This, too, though, is a fund that does receive infusions of 1 cent funding as well, albeit not near the size that the water fund does. Once we get past this year and, of course, fiscal year 24, we don't want to see this type of activity continue or get worse. But if indeed 1 cent doesn't pass, then we have a very similar concern as it relates to the sewer fund. You can see here that with that $500,000 missing from here, the cash position of the fund is all of a sudden upside down, over and above what we have available for the reserves. And so, if we could switch back to the sewer funds pro forma, you can see what I mean. Sewer fund is a little more profound in its response because it's in a repair position as it is already in the very near out years coming up.
That's really small.
Yeah, that is very small. But if we take out the 500,000, as you can see here, you'll see what happens. I mean, just immediately it goes toward the red line, and the red line means, as we all know, broke. I would suggest that for all of these funds, operating around here is much more preferred than operating around here, because we're continually dipping into reserves and using reserves with this sort of activity as a means of balancing your budget. And I don't think that's a good move when it comes to managing a utility. So we have this green line in here. It's kind of a warning track, if you will, so that you know where a more optimal operating position is, right around here, versus a less optimal operating position, which is here, and is tantamount to using reserves to balancing your budget. And I will recommend that as few a time as absolutely possible, even though we're comfortable with a temporary dip to help deal with some capital and sewer and offset some rate increases that potentially will be needed here soon. But without 1 cent, even in a fund like sewer, it just gets worse and worse without some strategy to replace it, i.e. more revenue from somewhere else, or doing quite a bit less by way of replacing sewer lines in our community.
Less than once every 300 years?
Right. I'm really banking on PVC holding up for a long time. So let's go back to the worksheet. Okay. This is what we're proposing for fiscal year 23, just to kind of reset ourselves for the sewer fund. As we move forward into the sanitation funds, however, you all know that sanitation does not receive any 1 cent funding. That's a fund that council has not seen the need to do, and I'm not recommending it. Revenue here compared to operating in the refuse fund is positive. However, you will notice that we've got a pretty aggressive capital campaign with respect to the refuse fund. You'll recall that over the last couple years, in order to help sustain the refuse fund as well as to work out some of the expense issues and dealing with commodity concerns and so on, we put off a number of sanitation truck purchases. Well, we're suggesting that waiting for another year to, not buy sanitation trucks is not the appropriate move forward. And so we're suggesting that time has come to make some pretty big purchases in that regard. And this is primarily what that's involving right here. Roll-off trucks and some loaders and whatnot that you see going around our community. This is probably more abnormal as it relates to those kinds of expenses from year to year. Accordingly, you can see cash is impacted to the extent that we're diving below that black line as we see here. The good news is, which is actually better than what you saw back in December or whatever, the trajectory is the right trajectory. And so within a year, we're crossing the plane, as it were, with respect to making money back and getting back into a more normal operating and potentially even optimal operating condition for the refuse fund. So this trajectory is not new to you. You're familiar and understand that this is a temporary break into the reserves, and I'm happy to see that better than I expected. By the time we get to the end of fiscal year 24, we're going to be in a much better shape in this fund, assuming we don't have more issues like we experienced during the pandemic. Okay. The bigger fund, of course, is the bail fill fund. A lot goes on here that you're aware of. We have other customers other than our own citizens. We've got regional customers. We've got a much more profound relationship with industrial customers in the bail fill fund. We do see some cash impact here that isn't that profound to where we are able to actually add to our cash position, albeit very moderately. This is good news for the bail fill fund, and I certainly appreciate that. This is where we're at the end of fiscal year 23. We know, however, that this is not optimal here, particularly when it comes to needing to build a landfill cell in probably 5 years or 6 years, maybe 7 or 8 years from this point forward. So I would suggest that the savings needs to start here for those projects, even though maybe not as profound as that, but working our way up over the next 6 or 7, maybe even 8 years, which has allowed us to sustain that kind of strategy anyway, has allowed us to sustain the creation of the landfill cells that we're currently engaged in contracting right now. So we'll certainly want to keep an eye on this. With any luck, the activity at the bail fill fund will be better than we expect right now. But even if we remain flat and don't do any better than we're expecting, we got to do something here to start building this fund up. And that is not new news to you. You're aware of that. So not a whole lot new here.
What was the big jump in transfer outs for next year? I noticed we've gone from nothing to over $30,000. Is that just a one-time deal, or is this something that is going to be anticipated in the future? What are those transfer outs?
Those transfers out.
Yeah.
Mr. Mayor, do you mind if I defer to Jill and or Andrew with regard to that question? Is that all right, Andrew? Do you want to take it, or?
Mayor, I'm not aware of a transfer out.
If you look in here, I could share it with you, or he could show it to you, but we had one in 21 for $734, and now in 23 we're proposing $30,000. So it's just a 1,000% jump.
But I think I know what that is. I think it's to the river fund.
Oh, okay. So it's not like we're transferring product out to somewhere else or shipping it off or anything. Okay, because if we were, I was wondering if that was going to be something that was going to be that we were going to have to do in the future, if this is just a one-time thing.
I would suspect that type of contribution to the river fund is not something we'll have to do every single year.
Right.
Steve Catholic.
And I believe that the last time Cindy was in, she mentioned that we are no longer taking turbine blades, that has kind of run its course,
Right.
and they're recycling them, whatever. Now, is there any talk about digging those back up and selling them to somebody?
Mr. Vice Mayor, Councilman, you're correct. That market, if you will, or interest that seemed to be pretty heightened for a while, has dwindled significantly. In fact, anybody that's come forward with those ideas, to my knowledge, have completely fizzled out. So I don't think we're going to be unearthing any of our blades out at the Belfill, the landfill. The private sector, in my opinion, has kind of jumped in between us and those suppliers to intercept those blades and do what they think they can do with them versus burning them in our landfills. So I don't think we're going to get any more of those.
So far, the recycle market has not picked up to the point that they need more blades than what industry is supplying.
Exactly. That's a very good assessment. Yep. So we are going to be wed to those blades probably for eternity.
Well, we took the money, I guess that's what we get.
We did. It was a great business prospect. I wish it were coming back because that was a fantastic payout. But I don't think so. You won't see any revenue planning in this budget for that. Let me make that clear.
Really quick too, I know Jolene had put some refreshments and some snacks back there if anybody wants any. Just feel free to get up and grab some as we're going.
Absolutely.
You can eat your peanut butter and jelly burrito. I know that I've known for years that's what you like.
And everybody is jealous that he has one and nobody else does.
I'll auction it off if anybody's interested. Do I hear $2?
Peanut butter and jelly burrito. Yum.
With cheese and onion.
Oh yeah, cheese. Forget it.
Serious?
Put cheese and onions.
No,
on.
I'm serious.
Yeah.
All right, man.
Wow.
Thank you, Mr.
But
Mayor.
that-
Yes.
Go ahead, Carter.
So capital. As I mentioned, we've got a $40 million capital agenda in front of you. And this is basically how it breaks out. You will notice that 10.7 of that is wrapped up in grants that we hope to pursue and obtain. I stand in front of you to say again, if that 10.7 doesn't work out, we will not be moving forward with those projects. Unless you tell us those projects are important enough to do otherwise, I would then have to bring forward a different proposal to you. But that piece of the pie, for the most part, some of these grants we already have on hand that we're ready to spend in '23, but for the most part, this is not something we'll be able to do without that money coming in. Everything else, from here over to here, is money that we do have on hand, is money that's cash in the bank, so to speak. And for a more thorough breakout, let's hand out those handouts. This right here, and this isn't information that's new to you either, but it does kind of summarize it much more succinctly than the book we gave you the last time. This tells you by funding source, in other words, which part of the piece of the pie here each of those projects will be funded by. And so with regard to that $40 million in fiscal year 23, I would suggest that if you want to, try to bring our proposed budget closer to what it is that we did back in fiscal year 22 at this time last year, or what we proposed to do, this would be the area to where you would want to do it. I don't suggest laying people off. I don't suggest averting the raises, because at the end of the day, those are small drops in the bucket to reconcile that $18 million difference from last year to this year. This is really where it's at. And so my suggestion and challenge would be to you, if you see projects in there that you just can't get behind, I would suggest bringing those proposals to this group here in the very near future and amending this agenda by those ideas, if council would like to, move forward with that. So check this list out, look it over, and if there are things in there that we shouldn't do, that's exactly why we're giving this to you in this summarized form.
Kyle.
Thank you, Mayor. Thanks, Carter. Is this online at all, or?
The budget, I think the capital book is probably online. If not, we'll get that book online in short order. That would be sort of the resource material for this list. Without a doubt, the budget is reflective of, at least the dollar entries as it relates to this summary that you have in front of you. But the capital book may not be online, so we'll see if we need to correct that.
So are you necessarily a proponent of all these? And question one, and question two, how much time do we have to kind of get through this and then come back to the group?
To answer your first question, I would tell you that this is indeed a boiled down list of the variety of priorities that your department heads have identified. And so if you're seeing it on this list, it's because it's the priority of the priorities. And so from that standpoint, I would say, yeah, I'm definitely a proponent of this list. And to answer your other question, this is not largely any different than the book we gave you back in, gosh, I want to say it was March timeframe. And so if you have proposals you want to bring forward to slim this down, my hope is that we could do that within the next week or so, 2 weeks, so we can get the final budget prepared with regard to what council's direction is on these matters. Because indeed that obviously could potentially have a very big impact pertaining to the overall dollars that you ultimately decide to pass or not pass.
Lisa.
I guess I'm a little confused of why we have the federal grants, which is money coming in to do these projects, but I guess I don't see it as a credit as much as I see it as a debit. Is that?
Mr. Mayor, council member, I would say that if those federal grants do not come in within the next 12 months, the projects that you see associated with those monies will not occur. And so I'm not exactly sure how to reconcile the notion of a credit or a debit in that regard, but I would tell you, we don't get the money, we don't get to do the project.
Well, along with Lisa's question, how do we know which ones are tied to grants and which ones aren't?
That's a fair question. I think some of the categories, Mr. Mayor, should be identified as such. You will also see a category listed as private funding, which would be, donations and/or contributions from other partners. There's certainly a variety of ways that can be looked at, but for the most part, it would be other contributions, private donations, or labeled as grants, be it federal or state.
Gotcha.
And you'll notice that pretty well comprises this piece of the pie right here.
It does, I see.
About 26% roughly.
So Carter, to make it, there's council members that are going to go through this list and say, okay, well, we don't need this, or we'll cut this, and you want them to bring that back to the council as a group to say, okay, hey, these are my ideas.
Mr. Mayor, I think that would be the most prudent way of doing that, and I would certainly hope that if there are those proposals that come back to the table, staff gets the opportunity to tell you why they're on the list before they become not on the list, right? So for example, if it's a project relating to the public utilities side, I would ask that Andrew get the opportunity to bring Bruce or Cindy or somebody to help discuss why that project has risen to the surface, as it were, to be among the priorities of the priorities.
Amber.
And there's, this corresponds to that bat packet that we got a while ago, where there's like a one pager on each one of these things. in that
Right.
packet, right, so you could get more information about each individual item.
Mr. Mayor, council member, that is definitely the resource material for your summary list here.
Okay.
Absolutely, absolutely. However, if you have projects that you have questions about, staff would be willing to entertain them at any time.
I mean, I'd also make the recommendation too, if you're looking at stuff and you're seeing something for $30,000 and you're like, we need to cut that. I mean, we're talking, big millions and millions of dollars. And so for me, because I've been down, as we've done these before, and I've had where councils have sat and said, well, we need to cut this 25,000 here and cut this 25,000 here. And in the scheme of, like you said, is a drop in the bucket. But if we're looking at cutting millions, I do agree with Carter, because we've been down the road where they've come back and they said, here's what it looks like if we do cut this. Here's what so we gotta balance that with reality. We gotta figure out the common sense of cutting certain things that will definitely have an impact on the budget if that's what we want to try to do. Does that make sense?
Mr. Mayor, I think that's fair. I would tell you though, and just reiterate, and I'm not trying to be obnoxiously emphatic, but when you're talking about reconciling budget years to budget years, it is largely going to be at the expense of capital you may or may not want to do. So in other words, that 85% of that 18 million that you're seeing within the budget messages that you compare to each other from fiscal year 22 to 23 is made up in capital. I mean, that's just the bottom line.
Well, there's 2 points. One is, it's also extremely revenue driven, because the more money you have coming in, the more you can do in your city and for your city.
Right.
So that, you can't really compare year to year when it's like that.
Exactly.
But from my point of view, we hire you and you hire them, and we expect them to know what they're doing and to be able to do their job, and to sit here and micromanage them over any of this is not, I'm not in that position to do that, and I'm not wanting to do that.
Sure.
I just want to know that they're being frugal and smart with their, you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
And so any questions I ask you concerning this stuff are simply just for understanding and knowledge of why we're doing it, not to question them, because I'm not interested in micromanaging anybody that's in that position, or we wouldn't have them in that position, I'm assuming, correct?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, I think that's a very fair assessment.
But I do think it's okay to ask questions, because there's a lot of times we don't understand that. We're not in their seat. We're not understanding what's in their department, what's going on every day. And so we have to have these questions, because we're undoubtedly going to get asked these questions by the public.
Absolutely.
Well, you voted for it? Yes, I absolutely did, because I stand behind my people, and here's why. So that's why I ask the questions, because I want to know the answer to the questions I'm being asked.
You betcha.
So.
You betcha. And Mr. Mayor, that's exactly why we're gathered here today, to try to dig in for information, and if we have homework we need to do, we're happy to take that on too.
Amber.
Just one thing I would like to say about this is I'm very pleased when I hear you say aggressive capital efforts that we're making, because if we have the money on hand, I certainly don't want to be a council that continues to defer maintenance and push things off. So we're, to the greatest extent possible, I want to be spending money on these types of things. So
Agreed.
I'm thrilled when you come to me and say we have an aggressive capital plan and strategy for the next year, because it's what we need to get many of our facilities and our infrastructure up to the standard where it's operating as efficiently and effectively as it can. So I'm happy with it, and I'm happy that we have the money to do it.
Absolutely.
Thank you. And that is the good news. And I would tell you, Mr. Mayor and Council Member, not all cities and towns can talk about funding capital with dollars they actually have on hand.
Yep.
And so I appreciate the prudence by which you guys established that policy back during the pandemic, period, because that's paying off in huge benefits right now. Any other questions with regard to capital? The only other point that I would want to make to you is that $15.8 million of this agenda is attributed to 1 cent money. That are monies on hand, mind you, but indeed, without that, this whole piece of pie goes away.
Jack?
Thank you. I was going to not ask that question, but make that comment also, and I guess just because this is an important year to really be communicating about where that money is going. What is the plan? I know we have signage, and so for all of those capital projects that will begin, I'm assuming there's a plan to make sure that they're well marked and indicated as being resourced by that money.
Absolutely, absolutely. Mr. Mayor, council member, thank you for that point. In fact, if you were to drive over and look at the senior center parking lot work that's taking place, you will see very proudly a sign by itself that talks about 1 cent being the resource for that project to happen. So hopefully, all of the elderly customers that go over there notice that, because they pay attention to that.
They will when they don't break their ankle in those potholes that used to be there.
Exactly.
Yeah. They also
Amen.
vote.
Huh?
They also vote.
Yeah.
Right.
Without that money, we couldn't have done that project probably. Yeah. Thank you for that point. All right, unless there's other questions about capital, we'll move forward. Let's talk about subsidies. This is a big question that all of you deservedly have when we come to the budget time, and without a doubt, you view as being very important to try to minimize as much as possible. And we are with you in that goal. Let me tell you where FY23 positions us as it relates to subsidies. We're going to break this down. This is messy, I'll tell you. And so we're going to break it down. But what you see basically is a representation of the subsidies that each operation needs to survive. And this is recreational enterprises with Fort Casper. Fort Casper we kind of view as a non-recreational enterprise. It's almost like a parks function, if you will. Another one that should probably be up here is cemetery, particularly given the conversation we've had recently with respect to fees at the cemetery and that kind of thing. But it's not represented here, so you're not missing something. To give you a feel here, one of our largest recreation enterprise subsidies that we have, aside from the Fort Wyoming Center, is the Rec Center. And by virtue of this demonstration, you can see that $764,000 out of the fiscal year 23 budget will be needed to balance the operations of the Rec Center. That's one of our larger ones, as you are probably aware. And you can see the numbers down the line here as it relates to how fiscal year 23 looks in comparison to other subsidies throughout at least the last couple years. The one that, of course, doesn't generally need a subsidy is golf. That will remain true in fiscal year 23, albeit by a very narrow margin. As you can see here, that is $1,093. Very, very narrow margin. But the rest are going to require subsidies. Now, you'll also remember, and you'll see it in the budget narrative, that some of that subsidy is offset by interest income that comes from perpetual care. And you've set that up on purpose, by design. Interest income that comes from perpetual care helps to offset these subsidies, the revenue of which would be supplied otherwise through the general fund. All right? So let's analyze that a little more closely as we go through.
Kyle, did you have something you wanted?
Here, I'm sorry.
I did, thank you, Mayor. I was just curious, the reduction in subsidy for the rec center, I imagine, is the result of the rate increase we passed this last year, or something else?
Without those rate increases, Mr. Mayor, Councilman, this subsidy would look more like, somewhere in the spectrum, like between here.
Okay.
So I would say you're seeing some improvement, and you'll see how good of an improvement that looks in relation to the cost recovery goal that the rec center has established for it.
The rec center as a whole, though, is our biggest subsidy, is it not? When you include the aquatics, the swimming pool, the ice arena, that's all in one building. We subsidize that to the tune of probably $500,000 more than we do the Fort Wyoming Center.
That's an interesting point. certainly for purposes of this discussion, we do break those apart. But if you were to consider the ice arena as a part of that, and maybe the indoor pool that's located there, we would be rivaling the event center pretty quickly, I think. I think that's a.
Well, I just think that's important for the community, because those subsidies are what provide the ability for our children and our community members to go and enjoy these facilities at an extremely reduced rate. And it's because we're subsidizing it with taxpayer money that allows that to happen. If we didn't give these subsidies, the amount of money they would have to pay to take their children swimming or to use the weight room or the gymnasium or the ice, most families wouldn't even be able to afford to do it. So I think it's important, especially when we're having these discussions, that the public understands what these subsidies really mean and what they really do, and the opportunities they provide for families in our community. Because without them, we don't have any of these things. So,
Mr. Mayor, that's an outstanding point. I appreciate Councilman Nell bringing that up.
On the ice arena, I know in community promotions, we wind up donating that facility and things. How does some of those things wind up playing into that subsidy? Because not only are we subsidizing it to begin with, but then they come every year in community promotions and they want cash, they want to help pay for the ice time, they want, we are subsidizing the hockey group, which then turns around and pays the ice arena. So we're almost, are we double dipping on that?
Mr. Mayor, I would say you are double supporting the ice arena. Not dollar for dollar, mind you, because as you can see here, that's about a $240,000 proposal from the general fund and others.
Yeah.
But yes, that figure could certainly be considered an addition to this number here.
So we're pushing 300,000 in reality out of taxpayer money.
So I got Kyle, Amber, and then Bruce.
Thank you, Mayor.
Jed, you had your hand up. No.
Important distinction worth noting, Councilman Kathy, Councilwoman Pollack and I just went through the application process for community promotions. She'll be able to, as always, be more articulate. I'm sure she's got something to say, but we had only budgeted $25,000 total for community promotions, of which the ice arena, the user group up there, is just one of many applicants. So I don't know if we've actually finalized, we've just discussed where that community promotion funding should go. I don't know if we've actually finalized it, but if I remember right, those user groups pay the ice arena to the tune of like $80,000 for ice annually, and the amount that they would receive in the application, again, overall it's just 25 grand. They've received much less than that as part of that. So, also important figures to take into consideration.
And I may be thinking of years past as well, because I realized the last couple of 3 years, community promotions has been limited to that kind of money. But I remember seeing some of those where they were asking for some major bucks and major reductions in their charges. Okay.
Amber.
I would only add to what Kyle said. We're not getting cash anymore, so we can probably, I feel better about that. Hopefully y'all do as well. And then, yes, I did want to add that we're not subsidizing their entire ice time. They're still paying quite a lot for ice time there, and I don't think it would really be double dipping, because if we were charging them the full amount, that would just decrease that subsidy, right? It wouldn't increase it. The fact that they're not paying that money to us is reflected in the subsidy amount that we end up paying back, right?
Mr. Mayor, Councilmember, I may have gotten lost. So forgive me for not keeping.
Okay, I said another way. That subsidy amount doesn't increase because we are reducing the rate for them, because we've done that year after year after year. That's just part of the subsidy. If we were charging the full amount, we would decrease the subsidy. Right?
I do think that's correct.
Okay.
Mr. Mayor, what I would say is, generally speaking, for community promotions, Those applications are more centered around a tournament type activity that is an incentive for getting the tournament here, so to speak. And so it is definitely a smaller scope when you're talking about what that a figure actually accounts to. I would call it a $250,000 a year proposal, generally speaking, particularly as you look over time how that has gone. So pretty good average, at least, for purposes of sort of calculating these dynamics.
Go ahead, Amber.
Yeah, hockey is an interesting sort of exception to that tournament rule too. We saw soccer tournaments, we saw volleyball tournaments. Hockey is sort of spread across the season for the ice time, but overall, the thing that made me feel generally okay about their proposal and their ask was that they help us quite a lot to reduce that subsidy by operating out of that facility, because it was pretty substantial amount coming from those teams into the ice arena, by the ice time that they do pay for. So it was, we would see quite a lot larger subsidy if those groups were not operating out of that facility.
Amen to that. Yes, completely agree.
Bruce.
Well, and a couple other dynamics just for the public to know. Because of the fine facilities we have, Casper has put together some pretty amazing teams of late. In fact, our team was just in Vegas this weekend and played in the championship game in a national tournament. And so we've become more of a destination for people to want to come here now. That brings in tax dollars. It brings in, the tournaments. Everybody's like, why would you pay so much to have a rec center? The volleyball tournaments, the basketball tournaments, the hockey, just all the things, just like the event center. We end up bringing more money into the city and into private enterprise by having these facilities than if we didn't have them. And if we didn't subsidize them, we couldn't afford to have them at all. So I guess I just want to make sure the public is aware that these generate income for our communities. And taxes in private business, they just do a lot for our community. So I'm all about subsidizing them, and that's probably the biggest hell I catch is over the rec center and the Ford Wyoming Center. How can you guys pay $1 million? Well, gee, it brings in $20 million. Why wouldn't we do that? The rec center, I don't have those numbers, but I'm sure it brings in more to the community than we're subsidizing in the tournaments and everything else it is doing. So I guess that's where I'm at with subsidies.
Jack.
Thanks. I'd just be curious to know, like, comparing with other communities, are you aware of how this kind of compares in terms of how other cities subsidize these sorts of facilities?
Mr. Mayor, Councilwoman, indeed, subsidies are a discussion that every city goes through as it relates to recreational facilities. Rec centers are definitely chief among them. Event centers, again, chief among them. It is very, very rare that these kinds of facilities don't require subsidies to operate. And just like Councilman Nell said, most put them in place so that they can optimize their position as it relates to the sports tourism industry, because indeed Casper has done a very good job of positioning itself in the sports tourism world, and we learned during the pandemic what it looks like to not have that sports tourism for that year, 18 months, whatever it was. It was a big bite, and I'm glad we're getting it back.
Amen.
Thanks.
What, Steve?
Along those same lines, these amenities help the private business and fire department, police department, everything else in recruiting people from outside our community, because you have these amenities. If you didn't have these things, move to Shoshone. I just use that as an example, but I mean, these are the things that bring the quality of life to get your heart surgeons, your stroke doctors, the Wheelers, the Step Blocks, the Munozes, those types of people that come here And we've had several of them actually leave and then turn around and come back here because they've realized what we have, and a lot of it is because of these amenities. So it does help our quality of life as well.
I think that's true. Great points. And just to give you a frame of reference pursuant to a couple earlier comments, as it relates to your recreational enterprises, the combined value of, the recreational enterprises that you see here is in the neighborhood of 1.5 that's being accommodated in the budget in front of you in the form of those subsidies. That does not include the $420,000 you're going to need to balance the budget for Fort Casper. It does not include the $900,000 you're going to need to balance the budget for, the Fort Wyoming Center, or as it relates to the subsidies that they seek and hopefully improve upon. Nor does it account for the roughly $250,000 you need to balance the budget for the cemetery, which is not obviously a recreational asset by any means, but certainly a subsidy requiring function of the general fund. So that combined value, that grand total with regard to all those dollars I just mentioned, is 3.1. And that is not horribly out of line with regard to what we do from year to year. Typically contingent on how well the Fort Wyoming Center does from year to year, which is improving, in my opinion. Okay, moving on so you can kind of see how each of these operations fare with respect to the goals that you have set for them. Fort Casper, the dotted line represents the 20% that we expect in the form of recapture. And you can see how they're kind of hovering around FY23. Doesn't point us in that direction, but not unlike what their history is like over time. As it relates to golf, we like being above the red line. I mean, it would be great if we not only eclipsed the dotted line here, but eclipsed the red line in all of our operations. At this point, golf is, as you know, and have discussed a number of times, the one operation that is achieving that nirvana, above that red line. Moving on to some of the others, Hogadon and the ice arena. Hogadon is in the maroon. They operate above their goal a lot of the years, more than not, as you can see. Unfortunately, there's still quite a distance between here, but with respect to the goals that you've set, they're doing quite well. The ice arena, this is their goal right here. And, they're, for fiscal year 23, are getting closer, but not quite eclipsing that goal that you have set for them. Now, one of the questions that you're going to have the opportunity to review here soon is whether or not an expansion of ice actually eliminates this distance for ice arena. Because certainly one of the arguments they make is if there's more ice to sell, there's more money to be made, hopefully more subsidy to be consumed, or less subsidy to be consumed, I should say. That distance. We'll see that distance shrink here. So that'll be an interesting discussion to have, and the data that's coming forward in support of that request to the council should shed a lot of light as far as whether or not that is really true. And so I'm looking forward to see what that data suggests. At this rate, we'll call it a $250,000 proposal. If council were to contribute $5 million toward that capital venture, you can do the math. That would be about a 20-year return if indeed those subsidies were to go away. Obviously in year one, which might be a tall order, of course, but that's just a frame of reference for you to consider. Nice table to set for that conversation. As it relates to Aquatics and the rec center, Aquatics has interesting performance above what it is that you have set for them, somewhere in the neighborhood of 58% cost recovery. That is a very nice gap. And As it relates to the rec center, you know, we're looking at 50% recovery. Fiscal year 23 doesn't really improve that position in relation to that goal. Maybe fees would be the right way. One of the things that you probably noticed in your capital project, your agenda, one of the things we're suggesting is repurposing the kids corner into a fitness studio so that classes and programming can hopefully be enhanced there. That likely, you know, won't make up the difference here, but it's one of those things that we need to consider to hopefully at least improve their operations relationship to what it is that you've asked by way of recovery goals. Hopefully, those little things.
Keep going.
Do you figure the reason we haven't seen the rebound is because due to the shutdown in 20, that basically people have found other alternatives to get their exercise and they may not be ever totally coming back, even though we have raised the fees?
I think that's a very interesting question, Mr. Mayor, Councilman. Without a doubt, this is a hard void to overcome, right? And I have to think that with respect to this closure that took place, we probably didn't get all of our customers back. But the other thing that we are in a difficult position of as it relates to being in the rec center business, we really can't be in the position of being outside of our niche. And that niche is that of providing very affordable fitness alternatives, particularly with respect to what's available through the private sector right now. I dare say that we would ever have the facilities or the services or whatever that really would put us on par with, say, Lifetime as a reasonable competitor. And I'd have to suggest that maybe that isn't what we should be doing anyway. So as long as we're in the economy niche, we're probably not going to see a whole lot of distance made up to here, I would suggest. Programming, on the other hand, does a good job. And we don't really initiate programming unless it's going to make our money back, at the very least. So hopefully, our niche becomes providing programming that can't be had elsewhere. And that should make up the difference over time. But that's not going to be this Herculean of a lift that's accomplished, in my opinion.
No, I was just interested in getting back to where we were in 18 and 19.
Right.
We're still well below that, and I was wondering if,
Similar question, but for the Aquatics Center. Do you attribute the reduction in that subsidy to the rate increase, to added additional use, lowered costs? What was the reason for that jump?
That is a very interesting direction that this is going. And when we talk about aquatics, we are talking about the aquatic center, and we're also talking about all the outdoor pools as well. So that's all kind of lumped into one conglomerate basket of services. Zulema, do you mind describing that conversation you and I had earlier about what some of the benefits have been with respect to our approach lately?
Absolutely, Mayor, Council. So with respect to the aquatic fund, there's actually been a combination. Certainly the programming that Carter spoke about has changed, primarily because of the goals that you established for us. We've been doing some very aggressive analysis of all of our programming across the board to try to target some lost drivers or some opportunities that we may be missing. And so this budget for FY23 reflects some changes where we are doing more swim lessons, which should generate more revenue. We've actually reduced the hours that the aquatics facilities are open for open swimming so that we can focus on the instruction that seems to be very popular right now among the youth. As well, we've noticed that our rentals have gone up at facilities across the board, and aquatics certainly isn't an exception to that. So, and really just honing in as much as possible on expense reduction and really trying to be as efficient as we can with the personnel dollars that we have, as well as the operational dollars that we have to reduce where we can.
one of the biggest differences that we have in regards to what Zulima's describing is when we're doing instruction, we're not in need of as many lifeguards as it is when we're doing public swim, open swim. And so from that standpoint, that drops pretty quickly as far as that expense is concerned, and therefore benefits this upward trajectory.
Council, I may also note that as part of the FY23 package, I proposed to the city manager and has had some support for a pretty significant restructure in my department, which includes moving all of our custodial functions and our building maintenance functions under our buildings and structures division. So where a lot of the recreation funds currently have staff dedicated to custodial or maintenance services, those employees will transition over to buildings and structures, which is an interdepartmental service fund that charges out for services provided across the city. So in funds, specifically aquatics, where we're removing the cost of those custodial services and building maintenance services, then they're able to focus their energy on programming and the revenue generators within that fund rather than those maintenance and custodial costs.
I think it's pretty unique that that's rising, though, considering we 2 more pools just opened in our community. So that's pretty cool. That's a tribute to the programming and what you guys are doing. So.
We also appreciate council's support of keeping some 1-cent dollars coming into this fund, because that does keep fees for kids to come into the pool lower. And I think that was the whole motivation that council got behind submitting some 1-cent dollars into this operation. Moving forward, that's all the subsidies. One thing I do want to tell you, as far as the event center goes, there's quite a bit of discussion in the narrative dedicated to that relationship between the city and the OVG operating group. They have proposed an improved subsidy requirement for the city. It's not huge, and it's not something that tells us, hey, we've solved the problem, but nonetheless, it's improving, and I do think that their trajectory is that of continuing to improve, even if it is on small increments. So the direction that council seems to be leaning in terms of enlisting with OVG, I think it's the right thing to do. And starting on July 1, not only are we going to have a more favorable position as it relates to their funding a lot of our capital needs up at the event center, but they'll also have a better, I should say, a more aggressive approach as it relates to helping us with our cost containment goals. Because indeed, if they're successful with respect to using Hogadon that they'd like to, in the way that they'd like to, as well as getting some naming rights going at Hogadon like we've done at Fort Wyoming Center, the relationship that Hogadon has in its operations and its goals and hopefully going in this direction should improve. So over time, of course, but nonetheless, I'm grateful that we're trying that, and that's something we have not tried in the history of that facilities used by the city. So a lot of exciting things, I think, as it relates to this topic.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Carter. Sorry, to go back to the pools. I noticed in our budget materials, we didn't have historical budgets for individual pools. I was just curious, this year, did we make the change to start tracking those individually? Were they all lumped together in the past, or was there another reason we don't have like numbers for previous years? Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, I would say that getting you numbers is not a challenge with respect to each pool's performance.
Okay.
We don't typically include that in the budget document, but Zulima, how hard would that be to get some of that data?
Mayor, council member, we could certainly gather that data for you. But in fact, it is in there, it's just broken out separately. So where you're seeing where you have zeros in the historic is that we did historically have all of the outdoor pools under one kind of budget bucket. Mm-hmm. And now we have broken those out into the 4 individual outdoor pools.
in order to kind of evaluate the performance of each pool
Okay.
individually.
That's kind of what I was thinking.
Yep, so if you add the 4 outdoor pools together and compare, then you'll get close to what it was historically for just the outdoor pool enterprise.
I mean, on that note, I am curious if certain pools perform better than others. You know, I think that would be information that would be helpful to us, because whether it's features of the pool or the area that the pool's in, it'd be interesting to know if some are performing a lot better than others.
Mayor, council member, so I can tell you anecdotally, Marion Krenner is a 0 admission pool. So it is almost 100% subsidized. The only money that we make there is off concessions, which is very little. Mike Cedar, on the other hand, is a very popular pool where we do charge admission. And so it is the higher performing of the outdoor pools, with PV probably being second and Washington being third. But we can certainly provide some numbers to council.
I was just curious what the, you know, I assumed there was a reason. I was just curious what it was. Thank you. Sorry, Carter, you can go ahead.
No problem.
Get it, Carter.
Allowed me the opportunity to wet my whistle. Important category discussion. I appreciate the dialogue here. Any other questions then about subsidies? All right. Let's go ahead and move into what I like to call the budget myths that hopefully we are dispelling with this discussion and or the actual data that you have in your budget books. First of all, I hope you see that the city is definitely operating within its means, and this does harken back to the characterization that that we saw in the media of the city overspending its resources by whatever amount, and you all have seen that discussion. The reality is, particularly when you consider capital, we do fund a lot of capital with regard to balances that we have on hand. In other words, dollars that are waiting to be applied, if you will, outside of reserves, mind you, and the reserve policies that you've set, dedicated to capital. The Opportunity Fund, again, is another good example of what that looks like. The Opportunity Fund, by the way, still retains $5.5 million as a standing balance in there, despite what you see in your capital plan with regard to some of its expense. We're very, very concerned about making sure that operational expenses are offset by an equal or greater amount of operational revenue, particularly as it relates to the general fund. In the enterprises, I would say that might be a little different, but that's not without your direction to take planned approaches to spend down the fund equity, which is another example of why I don't agree with the idea of the city overspending. Because again, that is not overspending. It's utilizing and leveraging equity to get projects done that otherwise we would have to wait on. Okay? So yes, 100% agree that the city is living within its means, and I cannot understand otherwise why that would be suggested.
Hold on, Carter. Go ahead, Amber.
Please.
I just want to comment on that particular item. Like, I think that the direction that we outlined in the last budget process to go ahead and spend some of those down is the more responsible approach. I don't think that we should be, recklessly or dipping down into reserves or anything like that, but if we're just holding that money in an account, like those dollars are needed in our community. They're needed for projects that will benefit the citizens. We're doing nobody any good by holding on to more dollars than we need to for long-term stability and security. Those dollars are meant to be used to maintain and improve the things that citizens need and use in our community. So to me, that was the right approach, and I'm pleased to see it more in action this budget.
Bruce.
Well, and along that lines, when we bought the police station, I think there were about 40 comments of how does the city buy a building when they're broke? So it goes right along with this. I don't know who ever started the myth that we're broke, because we're not. We only spend money that we have. But the other thing is too, if we don't do these projects as they come to us, and we put them off down the road, it reminds me of the one-way to two-way. That could have been done for $400,000 just a few years ago. And now it's 750, and we're gonna kick that can down the road, and if it ever comes, it's gonna be $1.5 million. So at some point, that money has to be spent, and things have to get done around here. And that's one of the things that drives me mad about social media, is the city's broke, but they're spending money. Or, oh my God, what are they doing now? Well, we have to do things in order for our people to survive and to get along. So, but people just need to understand, we don't spend money that we don't have on hand. We just don't do that. So, and I know our budget gets bigger every year, and I've heard the comments already, holy cow, $20 million more than last year. We have $20 million more revenue. So when we have revenue, we spend it on our city to make it better. What good's it gonna do to put it in the bank? Because it's only worth half of what it was in 5 years. So, I don't know, I'm trying to educate the public, I guess is why I'm ranting, so I apologize.
Good points. Good points. And by the way, as you all know, were it not for the presence of those ARPA dollars, we would not have been able to just buy that building outright. So gratefully, those dollars were available, and we were able to make that deal happen. Moving on to another myth that's kind of been circulating around the community a little bit. We've had some discussion about this, and again, some conversation in the media. My suggestion would be to you that indeed the levy that the city has requested from the county has been the same for decades, to say the least. The city is not increasing its request. The city is not trying to find ways to get more tax mills from the county. The city has been absolutely static as it relates to the levy that it requests from the county, year after year after year for 40-some years. Furthermore, the amount of dollars that the city has gotten through property taxes has been relatively static for year after year after year. And so, given the fact that indeed we may be seeing some windfall with respect to property taxes being raised in our community, in my opinion, does not warrant the city, turning that back over to the county, which actually gets distributed back to the rest of the state, frankly, through the complicated process that property taxes are broken out to. So, nor would I suggest that in order to assuage the increases that are coming through the assessor's office by virtue of sending sales tax dollars back to Cheyenne or lowering water rates in order to have a dulled balance with respect to where it is we are as a taxpayer on an individual basis. If indeed those rates need to be dealt with, it should be dealt with at the source, and not with respect to other policy directives that need to be had that would actually put the operations of the associated rate decline in jeopardy.
Steve Brill.
Carter, the only thing I really wanted to add is, I guess, is another myth. If the city changed from its full 8, we just moved to 7 or 7.5, you're really not going to see, it's not going to make a huge difference on a tax base. I think people, what's being said is that if we drop it to 7, then we're going to see this incredible increase, or it's going to stay normal because all the assessed values are going up. But the fact of the matter is, you take that, we take our mill and drop it down, you're not even really going to see a difference.
I think that's absolutely correct. In addition, Mr. Mayor, it would have to assume that we're not seeing any increases in the cost of doing business anywhere else in the organization. And that is just completely a fallacy. This is another conversation that I typically hear every 4 years when 1 cent is coming around for consideration. That indeed a good reason to not renew The optional 1 cent would be because it's not being used in accordance with regard to what this council has said they would, or any other council for that matter. I would tell you that this council has been nearly religious about how you have spent the last 4 years worth of 1 cent receipts pursuant to the contract that you entered into with the community 4 years ago. And that's definitely, in my opinion, substantiated by the breakout of the ways in which those dollars have indeed been spent. You can see the lion's share has been spent on pipes and pavement and public safety, which is exactly what your resolution directed. It's what the survey data from the day directed. These other things were prohibited use, not prohibited, excuse me, allowed uses as well, and all consistent with the resolution that your colleagues passed 4 years ago. So to suggest that this council has gone maverick or rogue or the organization in terms of not following that resolution very, very closely is just simply not correct, as demonstrated by the actual data. So I hope folks will see that, and understand that, and believe that, and consider that as they consider the renewal coming up in November.
Carter, I've got Lisa and Kyle.
Please.
Go ahead.
So on this sheet, you're going to put in an employee for the Aquatics Department out of the 1 cent fund for 56,000. Is that considered community assistance? Where does that person fall in? Because that's salary.
And that would be considered as a part of the effort to keep rates down as well. Because as those operational expenses are incurred, that's what that subsidy is intended for. And so where that little sliver comes in, I would have to defer about the point as soon as you give me the green light. I want
Where
to
is
say
it?
here,
It's the same place as the swimming subsidy.
it is a swimming subsidy is what it is, but I don't see the swimming subsidy on there. Maybe because it's very, very tiny.
I think it's under sports and physical fitness.
What's that?
Okay.
Do that at parks and playgrounds.
We will find out for sure.
We will find out.
And tell you where that falls. Okay. But I will tell you, it's not in addition to what you see here.
Okay.
It's included in one of those pieces.
Well, just as a follow-up to her, I thought one of the things we said is they would never be used for salaries, wages and salaries. Well, that's exactly what that's being used for.
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, Councilwoman, it is definitely being used to subsidize the operations of aquatics so that the appurtenant fees that we would need to otherwise raise in order to cover the cost of folks coming in to swim would be more reflective of what our cost to operate that business is. And so that was the driving factor behind your colleagues 4 years ago suggesting that that was an appropriate use. And so if this council views that subsidy to be inappropriate, then that's what you would suggest for the new resolution you pass for 1 cent 17. The use of those dollars to subsidize swimming, however, is not out of line with regard to the resolution that your colleagues passed 4 years ago. It's exactly what your colleagues told me to do back then. And if you tell me to continue that, it will. If you tell me to stop, that's how the resolution will be written.
But then rates would go up.
Rates would have to go up in order to cover the operation of the business within at least a certain recapture goal that you would propose.
So, one second, I have Kyle. Do you want to say something on that, or is it something else, Kyle?
Thank you, Mayor. No, I would just wanted to ask, you spoke about people being able to see this data. Is this online at all, or can we get copies of this PowerPoint?
You can get copies of this PowerPoint, 100%. I can't guarantee that right now it's on the website, but we can certainly get it up there.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Steve Gapp.
In essence, though, we're quibbling over that one employee, but in any of these, like the sports, I can't read all of it, but basically that's recreation,
Right.
okay? And any place that we're subsidizing recreation, I don't believe all of that money is strictly going into capital, is it? Or isn't it subsidizing the operation of a particular entity, i.e., well, Marion Griner, we're not supporting anything there. So if we are subsidizing Aquatics, then the entire cost of everything that goes into Marion Griner, be it labor, be it chemical, be it water, are all being paid for through the 1 cent money. So,
In part,
yes,
because
and so that's what I'm getting at is, you know, we are showing this as being showing it as being part of 1 cent, but by the same token, okay, I've played this game before. I'm gonna turn around and give more to paying chemical, and so then I don't pay for the employees. So you can play that game within the fund to where, no, I'm really not paying for that employee. I'm spending it on the paint, the water, whatever else. So all this is saying that that money is coming out of the aquatics budget.
And Mr. Mayor, I would add to that, Councilman Kathy, that even despite the 325 or 75,000 that you put in there, the general fund is still contributing another 200 and I'm going to say 30,000 over and above that to keep it afloat.
You bet.
That operation. So, without a doubt, if council doesn't like that subsidy, council has the absolute authority to remove it, and remove it even for fiscal year 23. The challenge will be trying to find that other 325, 350,000, whatever it is, somewhere else from the general fund to make up that difference. If that is the exercise council wants us to do, however, we will gladly do that.
Bruce?
It's not that I don't like the subsidy, I just want to make sure we're being extremely transparent in our verbiage when we are asking for 1 cent money. Because it's just such a fickle little booger, and you know that.
Oh, absolutely.
And so we just have to be so very, very careful about how that's presented.
Yep.
So, but I'm all for the subsidy. Obviously, our community needs it, uses it. So we just have to be super, super careful when it comes to that 1 cent money.
I would also add, Mr. Mayor, Councilman, a lot of that money goes to Marion Griner because we don't have any other dollars that come in from a fee standpoint to support that operation. So the majority of it probably goes to Marion Griner. The other spot that you'll see that is with respect to supporting transit. Without a doubt, transit receives 1 cent dollars as well. And that is not related to buying buses, because the FTA does that for us. It's mostly to support the issue of people paying fees to get on the bus. And 4 years ago, that was an incredibly important directive that council proposed, particularly when I brought forward proposals that would have reduced the cost of operating that operation. Council rejected those proposals to reduce the cost of that operation and instead said, let's get some 1 cent in there so the general fund gets some relief from supporting that offering.
Is that reflected into this graph?
It is, and I would say that is where.
Public transit.
Blue.
Oh, look at that, thank you. Now, most of that is capital here, but I could not tell you that all of that is capital. I would say a lot of that's for tokens, to get people fuel, to try to keep that rate to get on the bus as low as possible.
Well, some of that money's probably in community assistance too, isn't it?
Definitely, yeah. And as a matter of fact, where you see community assistance at a rate of $3.5 million, and in combination probably with what we spend on trails, those would be external applications of dollars outside the organization. Is that a fair assessment, Fleur? Okay. So, that's an important question that you'll need to consider too. Because when this proposal comes forward to you end of June, July, you get to determine what happens for the next 4 years. Do we do swimming subsidies? Do we do transit subsidies? Do we do external agency subsidies? Because that's what those are. Or are we going to stick to pipes, pavement, police cars, and fire equipment? You guys get the opportunity to set that contract.
Good, Steve.
And that's, that's something we need to remember as well, is that, and it will come up, I'm sure, but when the Poplar Bridge gets replaced, it's gonna have 2 10-foot sidewalks plus 2 bump outs on the east side of the bridge. And that extra 10-foot sidewalk and those bump outs were paid for by private donation. That is not tax money, that is not 1 cent money or anything else. But yet, that's what we have to make sure that the public understands as well. That came from fundraisers to the trails.
Bruce.
We also need to remember when we make that decision in July, that we just saw a pretty resounding in favor of the 1 cent. Now what that tells me is people are happy with the way that money's being allocated. So if we start cutting here and cutting there, what's that gonna do to our approval rating, you know what I mean? So when we do consider this, I think the council before us was smart enough to be on point with what the public wanted them to do, so we might want to be careful.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair point, absolutely. Not easy role that you'll be in coming up here in the next couple months. Not easy at all. Okay, the last myth I wanted to go over with you that you've probably heard as well, and we've sort of referred to it a little bit here, that indeed with regard to all the federal money the city has gotten, you know, we're sitting on mountains of it and we probably don't need funding elsewhere. Just to be clear, that is one-time money. I do not think we're going to get windfalls of that kind of funding again in our lifetimes, at least in mine anyway. So, are we being parsimonious with regard to how we use those dollars right now? Absolutely. And as a matter of fact, your proposal in your FY23 budget suggests that the $12 million you have left over, primarily in CARES funding, should be left alone and sat on for another 12 months. So that indeed, not only we can kind of prepare for other capital needs that you're going to learn a lot about when we get our facility study back, but also so that we can hopefully deploy that funding a little more effectively and aggressively for some interest income that will only last as long as those funds are in place. So just to be very, very clear, this is exactly how dollars have been spent out of that combined value of dollars that we've gotten both through CARES and ARPA. This is the list right here. And you'll notice the Casper Business Center included it at the very bottom to bring us to a balance of just over $12 million right now. On hand, cash on hand. We really haven't spent it outside of what you see here.
So you're saying we still have 12.7,
12.2.
12.2 available for 23?
23 and beyond.
23
Absolutely, because in 23 we're suggesting you don't touch it.
Gotcha. Okay. Good. Lisa?
Isn't the bulk of that going to the police station?
If in fact we are allowed to move forward with a reconstruction of that building, which I hope eventually that will be the case, you will see me look at these dollars as an offering to you as an option to consider to fund that reconstruction. But that won't be until FY24 or beyond.
So as a follow-up for the CARES dollars, is there a timeline that you have to earmark that money? Or if you don't use it, you lose it kind of a thing?
Another fair question. That was, Mr. Mayor, more in line with regard to ARPA's dollars and the use therein. We have met that obligation because we spent it on the building for the most part. So CARES, however, We have done everything that we were obliged to do, which is contained in this list. And with regard to the reimbursement mechanism that the federal law allowed for, that's where the bulk of these $12 million has come from, is that, that reimbursement mechanism that, again, all part of the federal legislation that allowed for that. So in our opinion, we have met those obligations.
Kyle, then Steve Friel.
Thanks, Mayor. So Carter, I'm sorry, I don't know if I was following. The reason you're not advocating for use of any of those CARES dollars over the next coming fiscal year is that just to solidify kind of our position with the federal government that, you know, that we can spend them how we like to spend them? What's the reason we're waiting a year to use any of those funds?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, for the most part, I would say it is because we are going to need those dollars when you consider your facilities needs. Okay. And that data is not available in time for this budget to be passed and considered, but you're going to have a significant amount of facility needs, the Casper Business Center not the least among them, to consider. And so for those dollars, I would say you got to hold on to them to wait to see what that data presents.
Follow up?
Yeah.
But we are confident that the use of those dollars for capital projects is warranted, you know, that it fits all the parameters that the federal government gave us for how they can be used. We're confident in that at this point.
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, with regard to the way that the legislation is written, we're absolutely confident. Now, does that mean that the federal government couldn't get mad at us and come back and try to audit us and raise specters of things we didn't understand? That's certainly possible, but that's not what we're seeing. Like I said, with regard to that reimbursement model that they created, we followed that very, very closely so that we wouldn't have these issues.
Thank you. Steve Friel withdrew his question.
Okay.
Bruce.
Just one more. We have more money coming too, don't we? Don't we have another payment coming?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, the only money we would have coming is with the second tranche of the ARPA funding. And that would basically backfill what it is that we've spent in terms of this 12.2, if it hasn't come already.
Yeah,
And so, and it hasn't come yet. So that would backfill what we've already spent, as it were. But it is definitely promised to us, that's for sure. So.
Any other questions or comments about CARES and ARPA? Okay.
As far as some things to be concerned about as you evaluate your 2023 budget, I would have you keep these things in mind as sort of a, in my opinion, what it is that we need to be focusing on as accomplishments that need to be had over the next year. Certainly 1 cent is one of those. Monitoring the inflationary pressures and the possibility of recessionary issues that could potentially be coming forward. We've already talked about facility needs. That data is going to be very, very helpful to us and probably drive a lot of your decisions. This is what I would have you pay attention to over the next year, in my humble opinion. And with that, Mr. Mayor, that concludes my presentation.
I got 2 questions. So Amber and then Bruce.
I have 2 questions, so.
You can take
3
2.
at least, all right. My first one is, when we're talking about the proposal for the 1 cent 17 allocation, I know we've done the public facing survey at this point. Is there additional opportunity for public engagement and information gathering, listening sessions or anything like that on 1 cent? Is that scheduled? Is that part of the process that's happened in the past?
Mr. Mayor, council member, the short answer is yes. Whether it would be a formal process like the survey looked like, I would say probably not. But in terms of data that you guys can take by way of input, absolutely. And as a matter of fact, you're going to have a lot of community partners who are going to be happy to give you ideas as to how to spend the next cycle of 1 cent dollars. And I think it's important to hear them out as well. So that certainly will happen.
Thanks. And then the second, stormwater enterprise, I've been keeping my eye on that since it was running through the legislature. What's the process now if we do want to create that? What do we have to do?
Well, first of all, I would only feel good about that type of a proposal when we have a reasonable business plan to suggest to you as it relates to how that would be used, how it would be managed and facilitated. The reality is the process that you would undertake would be that of following the appropriate ordinance creation to make that happen. And I say fiscal year 23, but the reality is that could be a fiscal year 24 issue as well. I'm not ready for that either.
So we'll be waiting for you to bring us a proposal then?
That would be my suggestion, yeah.
Bruce, no.
Haven't we, we've kind of already, through Jill's department, haven't we already kind of revised our investment strategy to a point through WildStar, and we've kind of already jump-started on that, haven't we?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, I think that's a very good way to put it. I think we've gotten a real good jump start on it. The Investment Advisory Committee has given us a lot of really good ideas, the majority of which you've helped us implement. I think at this point, or pass and approve, I think at this point in time, we need to really start implementing those things so that some of these pools of cash, like the CARES/ARPA dollars that we have left over, can really start to provide us some funding. The other thing that I would put a plug in for you to consider and keep an eye on, and you'll see some discussion about it in your narrative, is with regard to the constitutional amendment that's coming up for consideration in November as it relates to strategies that cities and towns will be able to take, if it passes, of course, in concert with the state and in regards to the tools they already have available, to where some of those investments will really start producing some fantastic interest income. So yes, to a smaller degree, but from a larger standpoint, that constitutional amendment will really set the sails for some of that income.
Kyle.
Thank you, Mayor. Your second to last bullet point, critically consider subsidies for general fund to other funds. Is that in regards to the 5 assets that we were just talking about a little bit ago?
It would definitely be, Mr. Mayor and Councilman, in regards to the rec center, in regards to the fort, in regards to ICE, and so on. We're hopeful that we can continue to adopt proposals that strengthens our position on these issues instead of going backwards. And that is, we've got to pay attention to that because it's almost insidious how some of these proposals can push us the other way.
Mm-hmm. So that bullet point's essentially continue towards these cost recovery goals that we're setting for ourselves. Just keep going in that direction with it.
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, when it comes to lease agreements, when it comes to rate considerations, when it comes to programming and those kinds of things, I'm hopeful that we can continue to look at those through the filter that this critically thinking provides. And you're going to have that opportunity over the next year.
Thank you.
Anything else for Carter?
In general, or are we wrapping up?
I think we're wrapping up. I don't think I'll do around the table since this is a budget session, so unless you guys are dying to
Early on,
go ahead.
Early on in the presentation, you had that chart that showed, I believe it was the revenue, that it went up and then it dropped off from 10, it climbed to 14 and dropped, and it's now trying to climb again.
Is that the sales tax chart?
I think it was.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it was the sales tax chart.
I think it was too.
No, this was a straight bar graph. No, this was a straight bar graph. It was back before all of, yeah, there we go. What I'm looking at there as well is, that shows the oil and gas industry as well.
Yeah.
That exactly mirrors the oil and gas business. And right now, you're not gonna see much increase in growth in the oil and gas business because of the lack of material and workforce. The way you did from, say, 10 to 14, and the way you were seeing from previous to '07 up to '9. Because right now, you can't get casing, you can't get a drilling rig. Right now, we've been told to get pipe for one of our wells. The only way we can do that is to order a mill run, and the soonest we would see that is February next year. To get rigs to drill some of our wells, we have to sign a 6-month contract for a rig. The small operators, which has been the bread and butter for Wyoming, can't do that. So your 17 rig count in Wyoming, I don't think we're ever going to see the 30 that we saw back in 21 or 20. I think you have seen about where it's going to be for a while, at about 17 to 22 rigs. So that's something to think about as time goes on.
Absolutely.
And it's strictly because of personnel and materials.
After midterms, you'll see it, Jeff.
Hope so.
Not if you can't get pipe.
Go.
Thanks, Mayor. I had two things. If we just wrap it up, there were just two things. Maybe there's a more appropriate time to ask about them. But one, I guess, was maybe for the chief. Is he still around?
He left.
Okay. Maybe Deputy Chief would be able to answer. But I saw in the police administration budget, $1.4 million for prisoner care, amounted to 11.5% of their budget. I was just curious on, how many prisoners is that to care for? Do we have any idea what the cost per prisoner or cost per offense is? I'm just, I thought that kind of stood out to me, so I was just interested.
Mayor, Council, what happened this year is we got an increase in, obviously there was a downturn from COVID going up. We've seen an increase in our arrests go up, as well as the sheriff increased his rates by $39 per day, so it went up to almost $140 a day per prisoner.
So that's not typical, that's an inflated year?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Out of curiosity, do we have data on how many prisoners our municipal government, cares for during the course of the year? Or?
Mayor, Council, yes, we do. We get a monthly billing that comes downstairs from the jail. We go through that, make sure we do a quality check, but it's done in billable days, and that's how we pay that. So some are incarcerated 4 hours, but you got to have I can't remember the exact amount of time before it's a full day.
Okay.
It's based off their sentencing.
Okay. I don't have to waste everyone else's time, but I'd be curious to learn more about those numbers and, breakdown of offenses and stuff like that. It's just it's an area of interest that interests me. And then Carter, I guess the only other question I had was, I didn't know that does the city fund the municipal band, provide their entire budget over the course of the year?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, that is actually, believe it or not, a mill that is raised, and we basically turn it over to that function. So Wyoming statute allows for that aspect of property tax, if you will, to be dedicated to that kind of a function, and that does happen.
Okay.
We do push that funding toward that operation.
So is that a mill rate that we set, or who sets that rate? Or?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, that's a statutory delegation, if you will, and so we don't really have the opportunity to say we're not going to do it anymore, or lower it, or even raise it for that matter. It's all fairly statutory.
But the city pays for it.
The city just
It's pass-through.
pushes the money through. That's exactly right.
Okay.
It's a pass-through. We don't have any cost into that.
Okay, I thought it was interesting. I really like the municipal band, but they just released their season and it was 8 concerts. So I thought, 140 grand seems expensive for a concert. I was just curious. Thank you.
Bruce.
My question, one of the things we had discussed several times throughout this year was moving the incarceration fees over into the municipal court budget. Is that something that we got done for this year, or is that still going to be a strain on our police department?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, to answer the question sort of in reverse order, it is a strain on the budget, without a doubt. As Councilman Gamroth quoted, 1.5 million bucks. That's a lot of money. And incidentally, despite our relationship on the Hall of Justice, we don't get a discount in terms of the rates that we pay. So we pay those rates as well as other dollars into that whole relationship. Be that as it may, we are not moving that operational line into the court, in that the judge identified some challenges from her perspective as it relates to the division of power in the government. And so she didn't think that the judicial function should be also the payor, if you will, of those fees.
Well, the problem I see with that is it doesn't give her any accountability whatsoever when it comes to sentencing and the amount of time she's putting people in jail. And that's putting a strain on the police department budget that seems highly unfair to me.
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, I think that perspective is certainly a reasonable school of thought. But as it relates to that division of powers, that is definitely her objection. So.
Well, I'd certainly like to see it put on a work session where we could discuss it.
Okay.
Just because she objects doesn't mean that's not the way it shouldn't be, or that the court administrator in our municipal, shouldn't have that. Because I know it's a strain on the chief. I know he'd love to get rid of it, and it seems to me that if 100% of the accountability of how long somebody's in there or the entire money being spent on there is coming out of that court, then they should be held accountable for the, you know what I mean, in their budget. It's just an opinion, but I'd sure like to see us discuss it in a more in-depth manner.
Sure.
In a work session topic.
Is council okay with putting that on a work session? Okay.
Can I add to that? Mayor and Council, if I may, some of the costs, so if we arrest somebody that's a circuit court charge, once they're accepted by circuit court, those fees go over to the county. We don't pay those, so I don't know if everybody understands that as well. And then the other fees, there may be sentencing that we can get done as a municipality that we may not otherwise get as a county. So we do have some chronic offenders that come to town, especially with the rescue mission that we have here. And they've gotten more and more egregious with their behavior, so they have required firmer sentences. They're charges that the county won't take on because they're short-staffed just like everybody else. So we've, in concert with the city attorney and even with the municipal court, we've agreed to some of these longer sentences just to make sure that those people aren't preying on some of our community members.
Right. Well, my concern strictly came from the chief. I had a discussion with him concerning it and some of the sentencing and forgetting about them and just leaving them in there, and and the police department racking up those charges. So that's kind of where the whole thought train came from.
Sure. And to be fair, I think we've moved past that and got a better system in place to manage something.
Well, good. Maybe we should get a presentation from both of you when we have that work session.
Sure.
So that we have that information, because that's news to me.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, anything else before we adjourn? Sean, do you have anything?
No, sir. It was a very riveting meeting.
What was your presentation?
Are you busting
You've
Carter?
offended Carter.
Yeah, Carter's crying now.
I thought it was
He needs to spice it up a little bit.
Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you, staff, for all your hard work. We appreciate it.
Yes, thank
Thanks,
you.
Carter, for your
Yeah, thank you.
presentation. We
Absolutely.
appreciate that as well.
You bet. You bet.
All right.
Thank you, everybody, for being here and your time away from families and evenings. So thank you all.
Supposed to be off.
Good. Thanks, everybody.
Thank
So
you.
we're taking next Tuesday off instead?
Yeah. Take next Tuesday off. Excuse me.